Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? Thank you so much for tuning in to another week of the podcast. This has been an amazing week. We had some incredible things happening at Heart and Soil. We launched Firestarter, we launched Gut and Digestion, and the response was insane. I am so stoked to be sharing this knowledge with you guys. I am so excited that you are all finding benefit in the products that we are making and appreciating the incredibly deep nutrition that nose-to-tail eating allows all of us to incorporate into our lives. It is such a bounty from nature, for lack of a less passé saying, that these are the foods that our ancestors would have celebrated. They would have gathered around the fire and sung and danced and looked at the stars and sung and told stories and been grateful and smiled and really appreciated how beautiful life was, especially when they had the bounty of animal foods. And so it is so cool to be able to make products here at Heart and Soil that are really food, that allow us to reclaim that ancestral birthright to radical health and vitality and happiness and dancing and song and community and communion with our families by bringing us back to health. And so I am grateful to do this work, and I am incredibly proud of what we do, and I am incredibly happy that you are all benefiting from that. So check us out at heartandsoil.co.co. We have Blood Builder coming in the next week or two, in addition to histamine and immune. And right now we have beef organs, bone marrow and liver, Firestarter, which is our high stearic acid tallow, and we have gut and digestion with tripe and stomach for leaky gut and GI issues. So here's the thing. In the mainstream media, or at least in the Twitter sphere and the Instagram sphere, I sometimes see influencers poking fun at people who suggest that vegetables might be harming humans, or that polyunsaturated fats might be harming humans. And they say things like, I ate vegetables and PUFAs and fructose, which I'm not afraid of, for breakfast this morning, and I didn't spontaneously combust. And I think it's such a smug thing that they're driving at here. And I think to myself, what do these smug influencers actually think is causing human disease? Because we can't really deny that humans are getting sicker, that we are chronically ill, that in the last 30 years, in the last 60 years, we have become a decrepit society. We are a shadow of our former selves. We are more sick. Something is causing this. And I saw another one of these smug influencers tweet something and said, there are no good or bad foods. There are only foods with more calories or more or less micronutrients. And I thought, oh, do these guys really believe that all human disease is caused by overeating? That hypercaloric states are the main driver of illness? Because that's ridiculous. I know so many people afflicted by autoimmune disease who are slim, who are eating caloric deficits. I had autoimmune disease when I was 8 years old as a child. Was I in a caloric excess? Did I have insulin resistance as an 8-year-old child because I was eating, because I was eating extra calories? No, I was eating the wrong foods. So I want to make this very clear that my position is I disagree with these guys 100%, and I will fight to this for the rest of my life. I think there is a species-appropriate diet for humans. I think there are good and bad foods. And that is why I do what I do. Because I want to understand from a medical perspective, from a biochemical perspective, what the good and bad foods are for humans. What are the foods that allow us to thrive? And what are the foods that make us ill? We shouldn't have to keep ourselves in a caloric prison day in and day out to lose weight. We shouldn't have to just calorie restrict. This idea that there are no good or bad foods is ludicrous. It's the calories in, calories out rubbish, and it fails. And it fails because we are not giving our body a species-appropriate diet. But when we appreciate what the, quote, good foods are, when we give our body a species-appropriate diet, then we thrive. And we don't even have to worry about how much we're eating because we find satiety, because we find vitality. This is the radical health that we are missing as a people, and this is the knowledge that has been lost amongst our current society, amongst our current contemporary amnesia from where we've come from as people. If we were living in the wild, like Hadza hunter-gatherers or other indigenous peoples, we would know this. We would understand what the foods were that were species appropriate for humans, but we've lost that knowledge. We have become forgetful. And so what we do at Heart and Soil, what I do in my life's work, is to understand this, to be someone that explores, to help us all remember how we're supposed to eat, remember what a species appropriate diet, remember what the foods are that bring us life and vitality. That's why we do what we do at Heart and Soil. And that's what I do with this podcast. And so those are my passions right now. In today's podcast, I'm so stoked to have Brad Marshall of the Croissant Diet. Brad is a really cool guy. We had awesome conversations in this podcast about saturated fat, which we've been told is bad for us, stearic acid, linoleic acid. This is a deep one, you guys. Listen to this one in context of last week's conversation with Ben Beekman. The middle part of the video got cut off because of my iPhone and something weird, but it was recording on site at Heart and Soil headquarters, Heart and Soil HQ. This is a deep one though. Look at the show notes if you want the references to the articles. You can find Brad's blog at Fire in a Bottle, and you can find his work at firebrandmeats.com. This is his low PUFA pork, firebrandmeats.com. This is his low PUFA pork and chicken project, which I really think is amazing. He's also on Reddit with a subreddit, Saturated Fat, doing a lot of these cool discussions. So really appreciate Brad. He has a genetics degree from Cornell, a certificate from the French Culinary Institute, studied cancer at Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center. He worked as a programmer for the Berkeley Drosophila Genome Project and spent the last 15 years raising rotationally grazed and pastured pork in New York. So he's basically like a nerd who became a farmer, which is exactly who you want raising your pork and chicken if you're going to eat those foods. So check out what he's doing at Firebrand. Check out Fire in a Bottle. It's an awesome summary. And I'm going to try and get Peter from Hyperlipid on the podcast very soon for more of these deep conversations about PUFA, which I would consider to be a signal to humans to get fat. It's not a bad food. It's just that we are eating way too much of it today, an evolutionarily inconsistent amount, and we're eating not enough stearic acid, which is why I think Firestarter is so important, why I think suet is so important for humans, and we're just not eating enough organs. We're missing out on these peptides. So that is my intro. Thank you to my sponsors. Talk about good people raising your food. We're talking about White Oak Pastures. WhiteOakPastures.com. This is a 6th generation farm, 20 plus years regenerative agriculture there. They have new low PUFA, low corn and soy fed chickens, and you can find those on the website. You can use my code CarnivoreMD for 10% off your first order. So White Oak is so cool. I said to them, hey, I'm worried about feeding chickens corn and soy. Well, you guys raise chickens in a different way. And they said, yeah, let's try it. So they have low corn and soy. They have no corn and soy, or corn and soy free chickens after the first month. So they're going to do a whole batch of chickens with no corn and soy, but these are definitely lower in linoleic acid. I saw the fatty acid analysis. White Oak always does this for me. They'll get the fatty acid analysis. They'll get the nutrient analysis of all the foods they make. It's so cool. They make delicious meat and organs. Give them a call. Talk to Sarah. I'm going to be there really soon getting some photographs for my cookbook. I'll post some of that online, but I love the people at White Oak Pastures, whiteoakpastures.com. Amazing grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised, really the stewards, the leaders in this field in Georgia. Carnivore MD for 10% off. Amazing people. And hand in hand with White Oak Pastures are my friends at Belcampo, belcampo.com. You know what's so cool about Belcampo is that they have taken this to heart as well. They are regenerative, they are grass-fed, and they are on the West Coast. So if you're East Coast, White Oak is great. If you're on the West Coast or in the center of the country, Belcampo is closer to you. They're going to be able to get it to you faster. But Belcampo made a carnivore bundle for me and for you guys. It has organic grass-fed beef. It has ribeye steaks. It has heart. It has liver. It has my favorite stew meat. And it has suet. So it's like a nose-to-tail bundle out at Belcampo. They also have keto bundles. They have all kinds of stuff. And you can get 2 pounds of stew meat at Belcampo for $17. And they have a code. They're going to let me do another code. They're doing another offering for you guys. Carnivore MD will get you 20% off through the end of October at Belcampo. You can get 2 pounds of stew meat for $15, you guys. $15, $7.50 a pound for stew meat. I make bone broth. They sell bone broth as well. I like to blanch it. You can get bone marrow bones, tenderloin tips and tails, suet. You can get liver, heart. You can get steaks that will blow your socks off. Check them out, belcampo.com, doing the good work. You guys know I did a whole podcast with Anya Fernald from Belcampo. I love these guys so much. They are good people doing good things. So check out whiteoakpastures.com. Check out belcampo.com. Use my code CarnivoreMD for 20% off your order at belcampo.com. Support regenerative agriculture, you guys. This is the future. This is the future. This was what will change how we live and breathe and function as humans, because we will be so much healthier as individuals. And if you are interested in understanding your blood work, you should check out Let's Get Checked. So this is trylgc.com, trylgc.com/carnivoremd will get you to the discounts at Let's Get Checked. They'll get you 20% off your order, and you can get your testosterone checked. Testosterone deficiencies are rampant. They are so common today. We need to know about these things, and they're affecting us dudes in all kinds of ways. They're just way too understood. They're understood. Healthy sperm counts have dropped 50% in the last 40 years. Hormonal imbalances are common in men and women. 1 in 4 men under over 30 are low in testosterone, have a hormonal imbalance, all kinds of bad symptoms, low energy, fatigue, erectile dysfunction, sex drive is low. No good. You can check out Let's Get Checked. You can use the codes for easy, confidential, affordable testing at home. You can also do homocysteine. You can do blood lipids. You can do CRP. You can do all kinds of stuff. You get 20% off by using my code TRYLGC, TRYLGC, CarnivoreMD. You choose your test online. It gets delivered to you quickly. You collect your sample, prepaid envelope. It gets them very fast. You can review your results. You get the results confidentially in a secure account online in 2 to 5 days. You can get 5 hormone levels: testosterone, SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, prolactin, estrogen, free androgen index. And a nurse will call you after a doctor has reviewed it. They are CLIA approved, which is the highest ranking level of accreditation. And it's going to let you know what's going on the inside and get you out of that funk. If you have low testosterone, email me, Dr. Paul, drpaul@heartandsoil.co. I will help you troubleshoot that. We'll get you some good organ supplements. But you got to figure it out first. And you got to know where your testosterone is. You got to know where your SHBG is. You got to know where your FSH and LH are. Super important stuff. trylgc.com/carnivoremd. This is definitely worth your time to check these things out. And like I said, they make this very easy. You can do it from the comfort of your home. You can do it from the comfort of your home. Check them out. Try Let's Get Checked. TryLGC.com. This is Let's Get Checked for your blood work. Give me an email, Dr. Paul, drpaul@heartandsoil.co. If you want to know what to get, I will tell you. I appreciate them and their sponsorship of this podcast. I love it. Also want to give it a shout out to my friends, the men and women at NutriSense, nutrisense.io. This is the CGM, you guys. I'm going to do a whole second CGM podcast. I love this stuff. Check them out, nutrisense.io. My dad is going to wear a CGM very soon. He's my dad. It's hard to get him to wear a CGM, you guys, okay? It's hard. I'm working on him. And they're amazing. Check them out, NutriSense. This will change your life. This will change what you do, how you respond to food. You will know if you are insulin sensitive. Like I said with Ben Beekman last week, there is no better way to know if you are metabolically healthy than a CGM. And I love the guys and girls at Force of Nature, forceofnature.com. They are doing regeneratively raised meats, ground beef, organ grinds, elk. It's really the only place I know if to get elk or bison or venison. Check them out, forceofnature.com. All right. If you love this podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes. That's how I get more ratings. Check us out, heartandsoil.co. For Firestarter, we're selling out fast, you guys. Always send me an email, drpaul@heartandsoil.co. Listen after this podcast for what is going on with me. You guys, I know these intros are long, but if you listen, the first 5 minutes were my little mini monologue. So hope you appreciate that. So don't skip the intros, because the beginning part is going to have a lot of my thoughts about the episode, why I'm doing this. Always give a shout out to my company, Heart and Soil. Always give a shout out to my sponsors. They make this possible, and they're all good people. I get so many requests to have sponsors, and I refuse most of them because there aren't things I want to promote. So you can remember, you better believe that if I'm promoting on this podcast, I believe in it. I think it's going to be beneficial for you. Check it out. Love you all. Stay radical. Listen after for what's going on with me. Brad Marshall, thanks for coming on the podcast, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the Heart and Soil headquarters.
Thanks for having me. I'm here in Austin. It's August. Weather report. It's hot. No one could have seen it coming.
Imagine that. See it coming. It is hot in August in Austin, Texas. But for those of you guys who are listening to this online, we are sitting in the backyard of the Heart and Soil headquarters in my little outdoor torture chamber gym, recording the first inaugural podcast on site at Heart and Soil. But I'm super excited about this one. We're going to get into a lot of interesting stuff. We're going to talk about croissants and lean, skinny French people and fat sumo wrestlers. And we're going to talk about pork and carbs. Let's start it off pretty high level. For those of you guys listening, just so you know, there will be times in this podcast that we are going to get pretty detailed on the science. The good news for all of you is that we don't have a computer here, so I can't get too detailed. So everything we're doing is from memory right now, and we will probably screw up a few enzyme names, but the stuff we're talking about here is really interesting. This is probably the podcast I've been looking forward to doing for a long time. Let's start with a blog I saw, a post on your site, which is Fire in a Bottle, and it's Emmy's story. So tell me about Emmy's story, and then we'll get into your story a little bit.
Yeah, and so Emmy had reached out to me. She's been, popping up on my Twitter feed, kind of asking questions, and I've noticed her for a number of months, and then she finally kind of reached out to me and said, thank you for so much. Like, I've been struggling to lose weight. I've tried all of these different diets. She's like, nothing's ever worked for me. And then one day I saw your Croissant Diet post and I said, what the heck, I'll give it a shot, right? Nothing else is working. And she basically changed. It seems like she had been getting a lot of pork and chicken fat in her diet. And so, and I told her, hey, I was like, if you want to, I'd love to post about you on my website, so send me your whole experience. So she wrote down pretty much her experience. She didn't go super detailed into what her diet had been, but it sounds like she had been getting a lot of chicken and pork fat. And then she switched over to doing lean meats. And then as a fat, she was using a combination of butter and cocoa butter, which is very high in saturated fat overall, and especially in stearic acid. And she said once she made that switch to the dietary fat, she started steadily but slowly losing weight. And this continued for a number of months. And then after a couple of months, her weight loss actually accelerated. And she said she had actually contacted me at one point and said, am I losing too much weight? Is this like, am I okay? And I said, yeah, no, I think you're fine. It actually kind of makes sense that if your issue was too much polyunsaturated fat, it makes sense that your fat loss would accelerate as you continue to eliminate PUFA, because your fat stores are eliminating their back storage of PUFAs. So the fact that you're seeing accelerated weight loss is actually kind of what I would predict. I haven't necessarily seen it in anyone else, but it makes sense according to the theory, right? So she wrote that, and I mean, she was like, this is great. Like, I was, nothing else worked. And I changed the types of fat, not the amount of fat, just changed the types of fat that she was using. Maybe she used a little more fat, and she was drinking wine, which I'm a wine drinker.
We can talk about that.
and it worked. And so I just thought that was a really cool story. And it was also good. A lot of people have questioned, like, well, I'm a like, I read the Croissant Diet, but I'm a postmenopausal woman. Could this work for me? And, Emmy didn't actually add carbohydrates back, but by changing her fat, she did lose weight. So that was cool to see.
And it's really interesting for me to read about, because you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago. I remember I stood out there in my driveway in the sun one morning and talked to you for no less than an hour and a half. And we were picking each other's brains, and I've been diving deep into this protons thread from Peter, so credit to Peter at Hyperlipid. And you and I have been sharing ideas for a couple of months now. And I've kind of come to similar conclusions as you and Peter, kind of as I'm learning about the work that you're both doing and thinking about how to connect it with the work that I'm doing with a no-till carnivore diet, animal-based diets. And I've been talking about this in the animal-based community for the last few weeks. There's been a lot of blowback. And I've been saying to people, hey, the biggest problem, and we're going to get into all this in this podcast, guys. You can listen to the previous podcast with Tommy Wood if you want to know more about linoleic acid and more of this backstory, but we're going to break this all down today as well. But the idea here at a very high level is that this polyunsaturated fat, this 18-carbon omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic acid, appears to tell our fat cells to grow. It appears to open the door to our fat cells for more substrate, for more fatty acids, for more glucose to come in there, for our fat cells to grow and get bigger.
As Peter would say, linoleic acid causes pathological insulin sensitivity.
At the level of the adipocyte.
At the level, yes.
And this is all we're going to break this down because insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance are terms that are complex and they are loaded. And so we're going to break down different types of insulin resistance. Generally, in common parlance, people think of insulin resistance as a bad thing. But as you and I break down this adipocyte-centered model of pathological insulin resistance, the way that our fat cells become insulin resistant will seem differently. It's a different light. We're painting it in a different light.
Exactly.
You actually want your fat cells, according to this model, we want our fat cells to be insulin resistant because that means they don't grow. And we'll talk about tons of stuff. But I thought this story from Emmy was so interesting because the more I thought about it, I was presented with some stuff from my friend Anthony Gustin, and he showed me a couple of articles saying, hey, if you look at the amount of linoleic acid in chicken and pork, it's way higher than it used to be because chicken and pork are fed corn and soy. And you and I have had conversations about the amount of linoleic acid in the fat of pork.
Exactly.
Specifically that wild pork is probably 5 to 6% linoleic acid in the fat.
I would think so. And, I wrote an article on my blog, Fire in a Bottle. If you Google disastrous trends in American bacon, I've also got a long post about exactly this, the whys. I'm also a pig farmer. And so I raised rotationally grazed pastured pork for 15 years and ran a butcher shop. And so it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I've seen, because I was raising the pigs and then butchering them, and we had a restaurant downtown, I could see very firsthand how changing the diet of the pig changes the fat composition, because you can really see pork fat, if the animals have too much PUFA in their diet, the pork fat gets very soft and greasy. But if you remove that pork fat, it can get hard, just like beef fat. I'm just going to take this opportunity to make a shameless plug for my new project, Firebrand Meats, which is we are growing pork with, I think, almost literally the most minimal amount of linoleic acid in their diet as you could possibly come up with a diet to do that. So check out Firebrand Meats. We're selling CSA shares right now.
I think it's amazing, though, because look, that is more of a species-appropriate diet for pork than corn and soy. And so what I've been talking about in the animal-based and the carnivore community is we should be eating meats that are eating what they're supposed to eat. We should be eating animals that are eating a species-appropriate diet. Grass-fed, grass-finished cows eat a species-appropriate diet. That's what they're supposed to eat, grass. Chickens, not supposed to eat corn and soy all the time. Their fat is going to get enriched in linoleic acid. Pigs, not supposed to eat corn and soy. So the stuff you're doing at Firebrand is great because you are raising pigs on more of a species-appropriate diet, and I think that's freaking awesome. So I'm happy to support that. And clearly, you drove up here in your Lamborghini, so you are funded by big pork. We just have to say that in the beginning. We're joking. There's no industry sponsorship here, guys. There's no beef pork. But my point here is just to everyone in the carnivore community who is reaching out and saying you don't need to worry about linoleic acid in chicken and pork. Well, look. I think the major sources of this omega-6, 18-carbon, polyunsaturated fat in our diets are vegetable oils, to be sure.
Yes.
The first thing you want to do is cut out corn, canola, soy, peanut, safflower, sunflower oils, and know that most avocado and olive oils are also cut with linoleic acid. You do that, you will improve your linoleic acid content in your diet. You will decrease it. But I think that the other piece, after thinking about this with Anthony, hearing this from you, is that if we are still having trouble losing weight, if we remain metabolically dysfunctional or not ideally situated from an insulin resistance or an insulin sensitivity perspective on a fully animal-based diet, it could be the excess linoleic acid in these non-species appropriate fed animals. And Emmy's story illustrates that beautifully.
I think it does. And I also want to point out this, not only are pigs and chickens getting linoleic acid from the corn and soy they've fed, actually commercial soybean oil has had almost all the fat extracted with hexane, which, they say that the hexane is all removed later. So they do a hexane extraction, which dissolves fats, right? And then they boil off the hexane, and the protein goes to the chickens or the pigs, and the oil goes to humans. after the hexane extraction. So that's something fun to think about. But anyways, the reason I bring it up is that chickens, in addition to being fed corn, are typically supplemented with about 5% of additional soybean oil, because for the sole reason that it gets them to market 2 or 3 days faster. And unfortunately, this isn't just the big commercial chicken growers. There is a national organization, the NRCS, and they kind of set the national feeding rules. And they've basically said that, well, since the chickens grow better with 5% supplemental soybean oil, if you don't give them the 5% supplemental soybean oil, that's like animal cruelty or something. And so they've set this kind of national bar that all livestock nutritionists will follow, whether or not they're formulating a feed for an organic mill or a non-GMO mill or a mainstream mill or anything. So you almost can't find poultry at any level, whether or not it's pastured or organic or anything else, that isn't given this supplemental 5% or so. It might not be the exact number, but it isn't given some kind of supplemental oil. Also, one more thing that's happened is that, well, two more things while we're on the subject. One is that something like 40% of the corn crop is now made into ethanol, right? And so you've got this corn kernel and it's got starch and it's got fat and it's got protein. And so they take the starch out to make an ethanol that we put in our cars. And then that leaves behind the protein and the oil. So this ends up being a cheap source of protein for the pigs. And so they feed this stuff right back to the pigs. But of course, it's like now it's, instead of being 5% linoleic acid, now it's 25% linoleic acid. So this is a huge additional source of concentrated linoleic acid that didn't even exist before about 2000 and, well, it was during the Bush administration that they built the big ethanol refineries. So before those ethanol refineries are built, this is additional source of oil for the pigs. And then the last thing is, in the 90s, they changed the genetics of the pigs to make them super lean. And what that did was the pigs, they just did it through like natural selection, picking the leanest pig generation after generation. But later, when they analyzed it, they realized that what they had done was they had downregulated all of the genes that the pigs used to do de novo lipogenesis, which means the pigs could no longer make their own fat, which means the only fat that they could get was from their diet, and the only fat in their diet is corn oil. So these pigs, and I raised a couple of them, not by choice, just because I couldn't get like literally anything else. And even on a good diet, the fat of these pigs never gets firm. It remains, no matter what you feed them, it's always going to be high in linoleic acid. There's nothing you can do with those pigs.
And so for the listener, de novo lipogenesis in humans and other animals is the process basically of converting carbohydrates into fat. We don't do much of it unless there are certain special circumstances. At the end of the podcast with Tommy Wood a couple weeks ago, I talked about fructose specifically with de novo lipogenesis and how small an amount of fructose is actually converted or diverted to de novo lipogenesis, contrary to what Robert Lustig would say. The rat models of de novo lipogenesis with fructose are completely different because they have a different physiology around fructose. What Brad is referring to is de novo lipogenesis in these pigs has been downregulated. So interestingly, humans, chickens, and pigs, we can't make polyunsaturated fats, which means we must get them from our diet. But it also means we store them. And so because these pigs can't do de novo lipogenesis, they are storing all of this polyunsaturated fat and making extra of it. So they're extremely enriched in linoleic acid. And we cannot ignore this evolutionary inconsistency in the amount of linoleic acid in our diets that is coming from these foods. And we'll tell you why in this podcast. The high level is that linoleic acid at the level of the adipocyte keeps that fat cell insulin sensitive, which means the fat cell grows. We're going to get way more in the weeds there.
Most bacon and almost all chicken has more, as much or more linoleic acid as canola oil.
Percentage-wise?
Yeah, canola oil is like, I want to say it's around 15% linoleic acid.
I think it's even more. I think it's like 40.
Well, canola oil is low compared to the other vegetable oils. So canola oil is, out of the vegetable oils, one of the reasons people like canola oil is it's more similar to olive oil. So it has a lot of, I'd have to look up the exact number. It has a lot of the Monounsaturated.
I got them here. Canola oil, 18.6.
18.6 is linoleic acid.
Soybean, 51% linoleic acid. Sunflower, 65% linoleic acid. So you're right. Peanut, 31%. Corn oil, 58%. Chicken fat, 18 to 23%. Pork fat, 12 to 14% linoleic acid. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, so right there, you've already got it written down. The chicken is higher in linoleic acid than canola oil, and the pork is close, and I would wager that a lot of pork is much higher than 14%.
Exactly. So we can't really ignore this, guys. And this is not me or Brad trying to suggest that you guys should buy expensive meats or dissuading you from an affordable way to do this. This is not privilege. Those are ridiculous criticisms. This is your freaking metabolic health that we are trying to talk about here. And I hope this information will be helpful. So, okay, cool. Let's talk about your background before we go any further, because you said you're a pig farmer, but you've also been a chef.
Yes.
And do you have an engineering background too? And
yeah, so I've got a genetics degree from Cornell University. And so I studied molecular biology. I worked in the lab at Cornell, and then I went on to work. I did a couple of years at Memorial Sloan-Kettering doing basic cancer research on. We were doing rat. I was in a rat prostate cancer lab. We were studying the work of protein kinase Z zeta. Not that was just the lab I was working in, but yeah, I did a lot of basic molecular biology, and then I didn't love the lab work, so I went on to work at the Berkeley Drosophila Genome Project, and I was actually a database programmer there. So I got into the computer side of things pretty heavily, and that was interesting. But then ultimately, sort of my love of food and my love of cooking, I grew up in rural upstate New York, and I was kind of tired of being in the city, and so my girlfriend at the time, Heather, and I moved back to the farm, bought this farm, built a house, and just kind of started growing things. We weren't really sure what we were going to do with the farm, but I got a couple of piglets, and I fell in love with them. These are great. They're hilarious. Like I love hanging out with pigs, but I also love cooking pork. I bought a pig actually when we were living in we were in El Sobrante, California when I was working at Berkeley, and Heather, in an offhand way, kind of laughed and said, somebody's selling a whole hog on Craigslist. And, and I thought that was kind of funny, but then it bounced around in the back of my head for a week or two. And finally one day I was like, I'm going to see if that pig's still on there. And so I checked, and indeed it was. And this farmer it was still alive. And he was like, yeah, our friend was supposed to take it. They backed out on the deal. And I was like, oh my God, sold. Right. So I bought this whole pig, and he was going to send it to the butcher. And so I called the butcher, and I was like, yeah, can I get it? I want the liver back. I want all the fat. I want everything. And I don't even really want you to cut it up. I just want like the primal so that I can break everything down. And I had a great time with it. I made pate, and I made sausages, and I made all these pates, and I made these roasts, and like I did a dry cured smoked bacon and like a prosciutto ham, and I set up this like tent of tarps over this picnic table in the backyard, and I like smoked it in this like tent, and the neighbors thought we had a meth lab going, and that was really cool, right? And so that was my first taste of like really. I had gone to the French Culinary Institute when I was in New York, and this was while I was in the lab, I was like going to farmers market and like asking questions of the farmers, and I was like cooking all the time in my spare time, and I was like really getting into the culinary side of things. And I went to the Culinary Institute, and that was like a 13-week intensive program, so it was like 10 hours a week, and I learned like basically all of the basic French technique that you would use in a classical French kitchen. So that really kicked off things. And then I got the pig, and I learned all the curing and the sausage making, the pate making. And then I was just like, kind of like, I couldn't help continuing to go in that direction. And that's when we bought the farm. And then I got these piglets, and I was like, oh my God, these things are great. They're amazing. They're hilarious. And so they kind of became pets, and some of them at first, but I just loved it. And so we started we started growing pigs and built a commercial kitchen in the basement. And we started selling like chops and, pate. We were baking pates in these little jars and selling it at farmers market. People just went crazy for it, right? So it very quickly became popular, and grew into this whole thing, and ultimately it wasn't financially successful, so I'm not doing it anymore. But it was a blast. And so, but one of the cool things about that is I got to see the whole process of like, okay, if I take this breed of pig and I feed it this way, when it's in the kitchen, I get this end result. And if I take that breed of pig and feed it the same way, I don't get the same end result. Or if I take the first breed of pig and feed it a different way, I don't get the same end result. And so I was a huge believer. Even back then, I was already avoiding polyunsaturated fats in my diet, but I could also see how much the breed and the feed affected the amount of polyunsaturated in the pigs just by how firm, like literally every batch of pigs that would come in, the first thing I would do is I would walk through the cooler and the halves would be hanging there, and I would just poke the back fat of each one to see how firm it was. And if it's a really well finished pig, and if you get the back fat right, it's hard like beef fat, it's like it doesn't even dent when you poke it. It's just, okay, that's a really good pig. I like that one, and I would load the pigs onto the truck personally. So I would know, oh, that big pig is the big black one that I loaded onto the truck last week. So, I really had the full sort of full circle, and I was breeding the pigs, so I knew their genetics too. So, it was like really, it was like this incredibly immersive way to understand that, yes, like the fats that you feed the animals really does affect body composition, and genetics really affects body composition, and, age of the animal, how well finished it is. All of these things are affecting the fat composition.
And I think that we could do the same thing with humans, and we'll get into that. There's a study we'll talk about later in this podcast looking at obese people and how the fat composition of obese people is more enriched in polyunsaturated fat than lean people. So that's a preview of that kind of stuff. But Brad is a molecular biologist, farmer, data scientist, expert. He wears a lot of hats.
And chef.
And chef, right? A lot of hats. Okay, cool. Well then, okay, so let's take just a few minutes and briefly tell people about the Croissant Diet, because this is something you're known for. It's this catchy thing that you've done. Maybe tell us a little bit about your experiments with the Croissant Diet, and then I want to get into talking about insulin resistance and get into the science.
Sure. And so the Croissant Diet comes out of really my French culinary background and my love of food history. I love reading about food and learning about what people did eat and how it's changed. And so if you look at, and I've got a bunch of posts on the website, they're called, a lot of them are called the French diet. So one is like the French diet in upstate New York. One is the French diet in Asia, because that's Tibetan herders are eating a similar diet to this. One is the French diet in upstate New York, because that's how farm families classically would have eaten. But the thing is, I've known for a long time that the French are eating things like croissants. They're eating flour and butter together, and historically they're very lean. And so it's like, so at the same time, I've battled with obesity most of my life, and so I've spent a lot of my life on this low carb diet. But in the back of my head, there was always this cognitive dissonance, because I know without a shadow of a doubt that the French and upstate New York farmers were eating cream and butter and flour and sugar, carbs all together, and they always stayed super lean. And I couldn't ever, solve that cognitive dissonance in my head, really, right? It was just always there, but I didn't know what to do about it. And
there's so much dogmatism right now in the low carb communities, and we'll get into this a little bit. We'll get into this a little bit later in the podcast, but there is a real messaging out there that carbs cause obesity and carbs cause diabetes. So we'll talk about that too, but go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to put that in.
No, that's a really good point. And so I literally couldn't, I knew I had done low carb and it had worked for me in the past. And I know so many people who have gotten relief from a low carb diet. And so, while I could see that the low carb diet clearly works for a lot of people, at the same time, I knew that this other dietary pattern had worked traditionally. And so in January of 2019, I weighed myself and I was very overweight. And I was like, well, this is kind of depressing. And so, I started doing a keto diet, and I was so busy running the business. I was, and it became too easy just to cheat and eat pizza or whatever. I'd sort of given up on a lot of my ideals, but so that's how I got overweight. But then I'd switch back to a keto diet, and it didn't, I found out at the age of 44, it's not as easy with a keto diet to lose weight as it was when I was like 25. Right. And so that's when I really dug back into Peter's blog, Hyperlipid. He's always been my favorite blogger, in part because I could tell that he was really smart, because I couldn't actually understand most of his posts. So I was like, I think this guy's onto something. He seems really smart, but I actually don't understand probably 85% of this. And so, and it's full of jargon. And so I had to learn, right, the whole language and vocabulary of Hyperlipid before I could start making sense of the posts. And so I dug back through, especially his protons thread, and read it all, and like, okay, a couple times through, read a lot of the papers and started to internalize, okay, after a while I figured it out. I was like, okay, I see what Peter's saying. And then it's funny, I was driving to my mom's house for dinner one day, and I was thinking about the French diet, and I was thinking about the protons theory, and I had like this eureka moment, and I was like, wait a minute. The protons theory actually can explain why the French are skinny, but also why ketogenic people are skinny. And also, by the way, why traditional like Chinese peasants eating mostly rice could stay skinny. Like, it actually could be a unifying mechanism between all these ways of eating. And that was like this, like the light bulb went on, and I was like, oh my God. And then I went home and like excitedly explained this all to my family about the mitochondria and the electrons, and they all
we're going to get into it. So yeah, next in a moment, we're going to explain the protons theory and what Brad is talking about here. And then after that, you decided to do this croissant diet, which is high in stearic acid.
Right. And so one of the papers we're going to look at presents, they did this rat study, and they fed them, I don't know, some kind of starch and stearic acid, and the rats lost all of their abdominal fat. And I looked at it and I was like, those ratios to me are like pretty similar to a croissant recipe. As a chef, I'm like, that's what it is. It's lots of saturated fat and starch. And the rats
not just any saturated fat. It was stearic acid.
A lot, specifically, they were using stearic acid, right, which
acid.
is 18 carbon saturated fat. And so I was like, I'm going to try this. And so I bought some commercial stearic acid, which you can buy. I sell it on my website, the pure food grade 92% stearic acid, which is kind of the highest grade you can get at fireinaBottle.net. But so I got some of the stearic acid, and I started literally making croissants. And which I'm not a great pastry chef, being a low carb person most of my life. So, I started, when I learned to make the croissants, they weren't the best. They weren't terrible. A little bit dense with all the stearic acid. Stearic acid's a funny thing. It has a texture like candle wax. It's like, it's melts at like 160 degrees. So I found that you had to like melt it into the butter first so that it wasn't just like hard candle wax, and then fold that into the croissants. And I started eating these croissants, and like my abdominal fat, like I wish that I had measured my waistline when I started, but it was like in the first 6 weeks I lost, I don't know, I'm not sure how many inches, but my waist just shrunk. Like I went down like 2 pant sizes in a matter of weeks. And I kind of couldn't believe,
croissants and wine,
eating mostly croissants and wine. Yeah, exactly. And
we could have gotten some organs in there. We're going to talk about organ meats with you, and some like actually getting some nutrients in your diet. But scientifically, what's really cool about this is that the stearic acid is unique in humans.
Yes. The stearic acid seems to have some unique effects at especially at really targeting the abdominal fat stores specifically. And I don't know. And I'm honestly still on the fence about whether it's unique to stearic acid or is palmitic acid just as good. And after I did the initial experiment, then I realized that that the stearic acid that I was using was probably only 60% stearic and 40% palmitic. So I was really what I was adding was a lot of long chain saturated fat. Butter's already high in long chain saturated fats, but I was making it even that more high, and especially in stearic acid.
So palmitic acid is a 16 carbon saturated fat. Stearic acid is an 18 carbon saturated fat. many people asking about MCTs, which are medium chain triglycerides. They're shorter chain saturated fatty acids, and they don't do the same thing in the mitochondria, guys. So they don't have the same effect in the mitochondria that these other fats do. But it's an interesting story. And so the Croissant Diet is born, you eating carbohydrates and stearic acid and losing weight. And we can start to tell people why that might be the case and kind of mirror Emmy's story as well. And so what was so interesting was that you contacted me and you said, hey, Paul, I've arrived at beef suet as a very interesting food. And so have you. And we've arrived at different places from different locales. And because I've always been interested in beef suet, I've talked about beef suet, and my interest in it was even more piqued after you contacted me. And I thought, isn't this cool? Because beef suet is 25+% stearic acid. It's probably the highest stearic acid you can get. Cacao butter is also high in stearic acid. Those are the two naturally occurring sources that are high around 25% stearic acid.
Yeah.
And so at Heart and Soil, we're going to make this supplement, which is Firestarter, which is a tallow made from high stearic acid suet. It's coming out soon. Maybe it'll even be out when this podcast comes out. But the idea is we want to help people get stearic acid in their diet. You should get stearic acid somehow, and we can talk about why this is. But the way that I've kind of wrapped this all together in my mind, and you can let me know what you think about this, is that I imagine, and I was posting on Twitter about this a few weeks ago, that when we killed an animal, we would get stearic acid, especially an animal that was eating its ancestral diet. Yeah. And I could imagine that being a signal for abundance. You have an animal, you have thousands of calories, you have nose to tail nutrition, you have livers and hearts and kidneys and pancreas, and you have stearic acid in the kidney fat, which would have been unique. That every bit of that fat was eaten by our ancestors. Yeah. The fat was critical. So that is a unique environmental signal. In only a few places, mostly ruminant animal fat is going to have high amounts of stearic acid. And that allows us to get lean. As we'll talk about, at the level of the mitochondria, especially in the fat cells, stearic acid appears to make our fat cells insulin resistant, which makes them not grow. Okay, we'll unpack that in a moment. The opposite signal, in my opinion, and maybe somebody else has talked about this, but it was just kind of how the spin that I put on it, is from nuts and seeds evolutionarily. We're going to eat nuts and seeds during times of starvation, during times of scarcity, or when winter is coming, figuratively or actually seasonally. You could imagine our ancestors having more linoleic acid in their diet. And as the linoleic acid increases in the human diet, we get a little fatter. We prepare for winter. It's an evolutionary mechanism. What's interesting about this, in my opinion, is that in 2020, really for the last 100 years, since Crisco came out with Crisco in 1911, we have been giving our bodies an evolutionary signal that winter is coming every single day of the year by eating linoleic acid in amounts more than 2 to 3% of our calories per day. Yeah. We talked about linoleic acid percentages in animal fats. Linoleic acid in a grass-fed cow is 1.8%. compared to a chicken, 12 to 14, or 12 to 14 in pork, 18 to 22 in chicken. We're talking orders of magnitude here, guys. We're talking 10x in a chicken, the amount that's found in a cow. That's a corn and soy-fed chicken.
It doesn't have to be, of course. Chickens and pigs can't make linoleic acid, so if we don't feed it to them, they won't have any.
Yeah, little tiny ancestral chickens that we would have eaten didn't have it. But where do we get it today? We get it from everybody. What do people on ketogenic diets eat? They eat nut butters. They eat almond butter. They eat sunflower butter. They eat cashew butter. These have more linoleic acid than grass-fed ruminant animals. And so I think my hypothesis is that a lot of people have trouble losing weight or plateau on a ketogenic diet because they're eating the nut butters. And then people will poo-poo this theory and say, nuts, don't worry. Chicken and pork, don't worry. Worry about the big things. And I say, well, that's fine and good if you're metabolically healthy and you've tested your visceral adipose tissue and you know that you're as good as you can be. But there's a lot of people like Emmy and others in the ketogenic community, in the carnivore community, in paleo communities who have stalled on weight loss. And I think this is the reason. It's these evolutionarily inconsistent consumption of linoleic acid, which I believe was a signal. If you are stuck eating little sunflower seeds and nuts and ancestral nuts evolutionarily, you are getting more linoleic acid and your body's saying, we haven't gotten an animal for a while. Maybe we should get a little fatter.
Yeah, totally.
And it works at the level of mitochondria.
And there's another interesting thing to think about, which is that there's no other food that you can feed like a non-ruminant animal. Like, all right, if I feed a pig a little more protein, is the pig going to be higher in protein? No. If I feed it a little more starch, is it going to change the pig's body composition? No, I mean, it might be a little fatter or a little leaner, but it's not really going to change any like, basic quality. But if you feed a pig linoleic acid or a chicken linoleic acid, that accumulates. That actually changes, the sort of basic nature of that animal, right? And none of the other macronutrients sort of like bioaccumulate the way that polyunsaturated fats do.
And Emmy's story was so interesting because it took her a few weeks before the fat loss accelerated.
Yes.
And I think this is, you have shared data with me. I've seen data to show that the fatty acid composition of our body mirrors what we eat. If I eat a low linoleic acid diet, which I've been doing for weeks now, I've been eating a very low linoleic acid diet. In fact, I cut out even egg yolks from my diet. We can talk about that.
Right.
I was just curious about it. The fatty acids in my fat will be lower linoleic acid.
Yeah.
Is it possible that Emmy or people on keto or carnivore who are stalled on weight loss just have too much linoleic acid in their fat cells? And we don't know how long it takes for this linoleic acid to get out, or if increasing stearic acid could perhaps push it out. It's an interesting theory. But I think it's fascinating that her timeline, though it's an anecdote, it's an N of one, is fascinating to think, okay, maybe people need 6 to 7 weeks of low linoleic acid before they really start to see an accelerated fat loss as they're getting rid of that linoleic acid. And as the mitochondria in their adipocytes, we're going to get to this, are actually changing in the way that they respond to insulin. The mitochondria and the adipocytes can signal with reactive oxygen species to the insulin receptor at the surface of the adipocyte and say, hey, become insulin resistant so the adipocytes don't grow. But this is a fascinating timeline.
It is. And whoops, I had a really interesting thought, and then this happens a lot with me. It was gone.
Do you want me to talk about something else?
I remember.
Right.
I totally remember. The other thing to think about is this is the thing I've spent a ton of time thinking about, and at any given moment, okay, what fats are being shuttled into your adipocytes? Well, it's a combination of your dietary fat and your stored fat, and at any moment in time, it's that number, the percentage from dietary fat versus the percentage from stored fat is, it's going to change, right? If it's immediately postprandial,
after eating,
it's going to be mostly dietary fat, presumably for some window of time, and then the longer you goes on, those fats cycle through the the various lipoproteins, chylomicrons, how they move around the body, but those ultimately get cleared and they get stored in fat cells, and so post meal the fats from the meal play a steadily declining role, and your stored fats play an increasing role. And so that's another interesting dynamic to think about. It's like I kind of came into the Croissant Diet thinking, well, I'm going to have a lot of circulating polyunsaturated fat most likely. So I'm going to consume as much saturated fat as I can to try to like overwhelm the polyunsaturated fat, which I know is stored in my body.
Exactly. I think it makes a lot of sense. If you guys go back and listen to the end of the Nina Teicholz podcast, which is all about saturated fat, which is so ironic because this is the fat that's been widely vilified, guys. The type of fats that Brad and I are talking about to help us lose adipose tissue that will ultimately result in better metabolic health are the fats that your government is trying to take away from you. I'm just saying, for what it's worth. Okay. So I agree with you. And you actually shared a study with me that showed that the previous meals that you have eaten can set the table for the type of fats that are released when you eat. The idea was that if I eat a lot of saturated fat for breakfast, when I go to eat lunch or dinner, there is a release of fat that happens more quickly than the chylomicrons could be coming in from the intestines. So the fat cells in our body are actually releasing a signal, potentially, that is from the previous meal. So if your previous meal is higher in saturated fat, stearic acid, animal fats, signaling abundance, you go to eat that second meal and your body is getting a signal that sets the table and says, hey, adipocytes don't grow.
Yes.
Don't grow. And this is what's so cool about high stearic acid foods, whether it's fire starter supplements, whether it's real suet, whether it's pigs that are lower in linoleic acid. So really cool stuff. I just want to talk about this one piece before we go on to actual insulin signaling. So I want to be very clear about carbohydrates on a ketogenic diet. In the setting of metabolic dysfunction, if you are metabolically broken, If you have pathologic insulin resistance, these are all synonymous, you are not going to be able to handle carbohydrates well at all. And we'll talk about why. I am not saying that elimination of carbohydrates is not beneficial for many people who have diabetes, prediabetes, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. These are all synonyms, okay? It is very helpful. This does not mean that it caused the insulin resistance in the first place. The insulin resistance, both Brad and I believe, and Tommy Wood, I believe this as well, many others believe, was originally caused by this mitochondrial breakdown arising from essentially excess linoleic acid. It's a little more complex than that. We'll probably get into it today, but it has to do with the adipocytes being overextended. That is the root cause. Once that happens, and you see people who are metabolically broken, who have metabolic dysfunction with excess levels of free fatty acids in their blood, they are glucose intolerant. You essentially must eliminate carbohydrates if you have diabetes, at least in the short term, while your body clears out the linoleic acid. But how many diabetics are advised to limit linoleic acid today? None.
None. Yeah.
None. And how many people on ketogenic diets are advised to limit linoleic acid? None. Yeah. After this podcast, probably 40 or 50,000. All right? Because that's how many will hear this. Okay. So, but that's the problem. And that's, I think, the shortcoming in many ketogenic physiology or thinking is you can just eliminate carbs and you'll be fine. Eliminating carbs will help, but it does not eliminate the problem. The problem is your fat cells, and your fat cells are broken because they are full of linoleic acid. And you are going to contribute to that if you keep eating chicken and pork that are full of that, and especially if you keep eating nuts and seeds on a ketogenic diet, and if you keep eating vegetable oils, which hopefully nobody on a ketogenic diet is, okay? So that's what's important to note. Another thing to point out, I'm going to get Ben Beekman on my podcast, okay? And we're going to have some friendly discussion about this. Fasting insulin is not a good measure of insulin sensitivity without carbohydrates in your diet. I'll repeat it. If you want to know how good your insulin sensitivity is, really you must do a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp test or an oral glucose tolerance test. As I've talked about on previous podcasts, if you are fat adapted, if you are doing a carnivore diet without carbs, if you're doing a ketogenic diet, you will fail an OGTT because you have physiologic insulin resistance. This is different than pathologic insulin resistance. So this is the problem with assessing someone's insulin sensitivity when they're not eating carbohydrates. But we cannot use fasting insulin as a proxy of metabolic health or as a proxy of insulin sensitivity in someone who is not eating carbs. I guarantee you that if I take a diabetic patient and I deprive them of carbohydrates, their fasting insulin will go down. Mm-hmm. If I give them carbohydrates or I do a euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp, they will fail. They will remain insulin resistant. They will remain metabolically dysfunctional until the linoleic acid is out of their cells. So that's just a little criticism of something I heard Ben say. I'm going to have him on the podcast. We get the full thing. But I heard him say that the removal of carbohydrates in people who are insulin resistant corrects insulin resistance quickly. And I think that's not true. It just lowers fasting insulin because you don't have an insulin signal, which is nearly as high without carbs. Okay. So what am I saying? Removal of carbohydrates in the setting of diabetes is helpful in the short term, probably necessary. Yeah. But eliminating linoleic acid and excess PUFA is the real root of the problem. We must do that as well. Do you agree with all that?
I agree that I think that the long-term cure is to eliminate the linoleic acid. Absolutely. I don't know if someone who's advanced all the way to full-blown type 2 diabetes, I mean, at that point you probably have other metabolic problems that could have to do with gene methylation and other kind of long-term things that might be hard to fix. But I think that without eliminating the linoleic acid, it's going to be hard to make someone metabolically normal.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree. And so that's what's important and I think this nuance is really critical because we must know what the enemy is. We must know what to tell people. That is the thing to correct. If you guys have parents, mothers, daughters, brothers, sisters, grandparents who are diabetic, they want to go low carb, great, but they must also eliminate the linoleic acid extremely, religiously from their diet, and They will get so much better. So all that aside, thank you guys for indulging my little soapbox rant there. We've cleared all that up. Let's talk about insulin resistance at a molecular level. I want to talk about
Actually, real quick, before we go into the molecular stuff, can I talk about the new feasting mimicking diet for a second? Because I think it's kind of interesting. So, after I did the Croissant Diet, I'd been sort of experimenting with it over the winter, and trying different things and seeing what worked out and what didn't. And I came up with this new experiment that I'm calling the feasting mimicking diet. It really has nothing to do with the fasting mimicking diet. I just thought it was a cute name, but it's interesting. So one of the things that I noticed with the croissants is when I started eating them, eating all that stearic acid with the flour, I got this huge satiation response. And I've always been a person who, like, you know, in the past, I was like, okay, well, I just had thirds. If I go up for fourths, I'm going to look like a real glutton. So maybe I'll just stop eating. It's not that I don't want to eat more. It's just, you know, my stomach hurts from literally having packed so much food into it. And once I started eating these croissants, I was like, whoa, I actually can't eat another bite. Like, I don't want to. The idea of eating another bite of food makes me feel physically ill. And that's
satiety.
And that's without my stomach even being full. You know, like, there were many times when I'd eat so much food until, like, my stomach literally hurt. And I still wanted to eat more, but I knew that was a bad idea, right? With this new diet, I couldn't believe the satiation. And that's when I started to realize, I was like, whoa, I can actually, like, eat like this, and I'm satisfied for a really long period of time. And that's sort of when I realized I could incorporate some ideas like fasting, because I was so satiated, which for me was like, we're in a whole new world now, you know, for me. And so I played around with it, and I played with what works, and I was trying to come up with a way of, I wasn't really trying to lose weight. I was just playing with different things and seeing what works, and then kind of to design the ultimate weight loss diet. And the whole idea behind the feasting mimicking diet is I figured out a way to basically maintain energy in my blood for a very long period of time. And that's a complicated thing to say, so let me just unpack it a little bit. So one thing I was noticing is that the saturated fat, kind of, as we've said, we haven't gone into the mechanisms of it yet, but it kind of makes you instantaneously insulin resistant. And so what that means,
we'll unpack that. Yeah,
we'll unpack that. But what it means is it doesn't, the blood glucose actually does stay in your system longer. And for me, I was finding that, you know, people might have worry about the long-term effects of that, but for me, what I was finding is that made me feel really full. And the other thing that happens is that it causes your circulating free fatty acids to stay higher longer. And again, we've got another paper to show that. But so what was happening is I felt like, so I'm having these big feast meals, and then after the meals, I've got blood glucose available to my cells, and I've got free fatty acids available to my cells, and I've got circulating chylomicrons, and I've got all this, and I'm drinking wine, so I have ethanol available, so I have all this energy available, right? And so my cells are just like, you know what, we're full, we're good. And then even the next morning, my blood glucose is still pretty high. My free fatty acids have rebounded pretty quickly.
Not pathologically
high, but just like
hypoglycemic.
A lot of people talk about going hypoglycemic after a meal with starch, but I've found the saturated fat prevents that.
Right. So this is not hyperglycemia high.
Right.
This is what, 70, 80, 90 milligrams per deciliter.
Well, I can be higher than that the day after. I might be around 100 the day after that. But that's fine for me. But I'm not hungry, you know? And now I've got free fatty acids available. I've got glucose available. And then even the day after I eat a feast with, say, 150 grams of carbs, I have ketones the next morning. I have 0.6, 0.7 millimolar, and that rises throughout the day. And then, you know, we can talk about this, but then I've been wine fasting. So that night I'll just have some wine to kind of like
wine fasting.
to just tide me over, right? Because it takes away the hunger response, and there's a lot in that statement too. But then
I don't drink alcohol, you guys, just so you know. I'm not endorsing this, but fine. Like,
well, you know, yeah, we're probably going to talk about it. So anyway, the next day, now I'm like 40 hours fasted, and now my free fatty acids are really high because I haven't done anything since that feast meal to produce any insulin. And so those free fatty acids continue to rise. My blood sugar's dropping, but I've got ketones. And so basically what's happened is, during this whole 48-hour period, there's never a time when the energy available to my cells is low. I'm never hypoglycemic. There's always ketones, there's always glucose, there's always fats. So like from the perspective of my cells, even though, I'm at 40 hours fasted, my cells they're happy. They're like, look at all the stuff we can eat. It's all in the blood.
And you don't get hunger.
And I don't get hunger. And so that's been the key to the whole thing to me is like, how do I, and a lot of people would describe what I'm talking about as, energy toxicity, right? This is a term that goes around. They're like, oh, well, if you have too much energy in your blood, you have energy toxicity. But I'm actually sort of trying to create energy toxicity, as some would call it, as a means of satiety.
Well, let's talk about satiety a little more, because I think that the key to weight loss for a lot of people is satiety.
Yes.
So there is at least one study that we were going to talk about later that we can talk about now. That is the ROS satiety and anandamide study. So at the hypothalamus,
yes,
reactive oxygen species signal satiety. So the hypothalamus is a part of our brain. There's a ventromedial hypothalamus. There's other parts of the hypothalamus. The different parts of the hypothalamus that signal to us whether we are hungry or full. Now, reactive oxygen species are produced when we are eating saturated fat, essentially. So we think of reactive oxygen species as bad, but this is an overly simplistic view. Reactive oxygen species are how the mitochondria in our cells signal to the surface of the cell that cell is full. And that creates cellular insulin resistance at that level. Now, insulin resistance needs to be rebranded. Peter has said this in his blog. I've talked to you and Tommy about this. All insulin resistance is not the same. Pathological insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction are not the same as physiologic insulin resistance.
In my blog, I've described it as the ROS is the signal from the mitochondria to the rest of the cell that it's time to get up from the dinner table and walk away.
It's saying we're full. The insulin receptor on the surface of the cell is going to stop working and other cells can get these nutrients. That is physiology.
Exactly.
In our brains, what we are hinting at here is that saturated fats from animal foods, which we will talk about why they create reactive oxygen species, signal satiety.
Yes.
And conversely, linoleic acid signals not satiety for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is that linoleic acid is a precursor for endocannabinoids like anandamide. If you guys have smoked marijuana, I've never liked this. I've never really done it in my life, but it's people get the munchies afterward. And that cannabinoids, cannabidiol, cannabidivarin, these cannabinoids in marijuana make us hungry because they mirror our endogenous cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG. Well, go figure, linoleic acid looks a lot like anandamide and is actually a precursor. Yep. If we eat excess linoleic acid, there's a very compelling hypothesis that excess linoleic acid gets converted into munchies in your brain. It gets turned into endocannabinoids in your brain. And there's a mouse study that shows this.
Yes, but also to the point, furthermore, the other problem is that linoleic acid does not drive ROS production in the hypothalamus either. So linoleic acid is hurting on two levels. One, when the mitochondria are burning linoleic acid, they're not producing reactive oxygen species. And reactive oxygen species in the hypothalamus, this paper shows, is necessary for satiety. Well, that might have been a different paper, but anyways, there's lots of studies that show that that the ROS is absolutely necessary for satiety in the brain. And so, yes, linoleic acid is not producing ROS, which is a problem, and it's also giving you the munchies through these cannabinoid pathways. So it's hitting on two different levels.
I told you guys we were going to get complicated. Hold on to your butts. Here we go. Here we go. All right, so let's tie this all together. The other thing about linoleic acid is that it can actually induce hypoglycemia. So as you are suggesting, part of our satiety is also based on the fact that we have available energy substrate as blood glucose, as free fatty acids, or as ketones. You got to have something in there for your body to burn, or you are going to get hungry.
Yes.
So here's the problem with linoleic acid, and this will all make sense very soon. When we eat linoleic acid, it does not create reactive oxygen species in our cells, which means it leaves those cells insulin sensitive, especially the adipocytes, which means the adipocytes can grow. But other cells of our body remain insulin sensitive as well, which means that when there is an insulin signal around, they take up glucose, which
Yes.
means that glucose levels dip.
Yes.
And when glucose levels dip precipitously, you get hungry. It is going to be very difficult for you to maintain time between meals if you are full of linoleic acid in your adipocytes, because the release of that linoleic acid is constantly going to lead to excessive imbalance or imbalance in your energy substrates by telling your muscles and every other part of your body to take up glucose when it really shouldn't be.
Well, and here's the other thing that insulin signaling does to deprive your cells of energy is the adipocytes. The way that they kind of feed the rest of the body is through a process called lipolysis. So the fat cells are taking their stored fat and they're cleaving off the glyceride backbone, and that part isn't that important. But anyways, they're releasing those free fatty acids into the bloodstream, and that's another source of fuel. And so one of the primary things that insulin does is it stops lipolysis from happening in the adipocytes, which is to say it stops the adipocytes from feeding the stored fat energy to the rest of the body. So if your fat cells are insulin sensitive, they are going to stop releasing fat for the rest of the body to eat, and you are going to be hungry. And so the whole idea of eating lots of saturated fat is to keep your fat cells consuming that fat, because that fat is transferred into their mitochondria and they're burning it and they're creating reactive oxygen species. And therefore, those fat cells are going to be insulin resistant. And so when insulin comes around, they're going to release more fat to the rest of the body as fuel than they would have otherwise. And that is going to give you satiety.
And it's going to allow the fat cells to not grow.
Right.
Because they're insulin resistant. Okay.
Right.
So
and because they're giving off fat.
And because they're giving off fat, because they're shrinking. They're shooting it out to the rest of the body. They're just like, have some fat. They're just throwing the fat around. So this model of insulin resistance is different than really anyone else has proposed. It is an adipocyte-centered model of insulin resistance. And what we were talking about now, we should actually say metabolic dysfunction, just so that we don't confuse the listener. So this is a model of metabolic dysfunction, aka pathologic insulin resistance, that is centered on the adipocytes. So what Brad and I are describing is you want your adipocyte to be insulin resistant because you want that adipocyte to not grow. You want that adipocyte to send out the fats that are in it to the rest of the body so that you can burn your stored fat.
Right. And I just want to give again credit to Peter at Hyperlipid here. This is essentially, if you Google for hyperlipid and read that blog, the protons thread is that's where I came across this knowledge, and other people have as well. And so we're kind of like channeling a lot of the work of Peter at Hyperlipid here. We're
going to try and get Peter on the show. He's a veterinary anesthetist in England, I think. And so
yes,
we'll see if we can get him on, but we're building on that work, trying to piece it all together here, guys. So props to Peter. If you're listening, we'll get you on the show soon, and we'll get you talking about all this too. It's really a brilliant theory. Now, I just want to point out that diabetes is not too much sugar in your body. That is an absurd theory of diabetes. I've heard preeminent diabetes researchers, endocrinologists, say there's just too much sugar in the body. That is completely false. That is completely incorrect physiology, okay? Diabetes is metabolic dysfunction, and we will talk about what that looks like. But I just want to back up one step and really break this down for people at the mitochondrial level so that you know what Brad and I are talking about. Let's just start with the insulin receptor, okay? Yeah. So, and we need to think about this at the level of the adipocyte, at the level of the muscle, and then sometimes at the level of the liver. But generally, we're thinking about the differences between the adipocyte and the muscle, the periphery. If you've heard me talk on other podcasts, you know that every cell in your body has insulin receptors and will become insulin resistant or insulin sensitive, including immune cells. This is immunometabolism. That was the first part of the podcast with Tommy Wood. And why, when we are metabolically broken, our immune cells don't work. Okay?
Yeah.
That's not what we're going to go into today. We're going to talk about adipocytes. We're going to talk about muscle cells. We're going to talk about the liver. But on the surface of our cells is an insulin receptor. How does the insulin receptor work? How does it turn on? How does it turn off?
Yeah. So this is complicated.
I told you.
So in I always say on my blog, biology is weird. And this is one of those examples. So it turns out that the way that insulin is allowed to signal is with a little burst of reactive oxygen species. Ironically, because what we have been saying is that the way to stop insulin signaling is with reactive oxygen species. So that's at two ends of the spectrum. To get insulin to signal at all, you need a little bit of reactive oxygen species. And to get insulin to stop signaling, you need a lot of reactive oxygen species. And so the insulin receptor is really weird. It autophosphorylates itself to turn itself on, except there's this other protein that's sitting there and it keeps cutting off that phosphate group. So the insulin receptor is literally just sitting there phosphorylating itself all the time. And then there's this other thing that's sitting there cutting off that phosphate group. It's a weird thing to do, but that's how it works. I didn't design it. And so what happens is that first little burst of reoxygen species breaks the function of the thing that is cutting off the phosphate group as the insulin receptor is autophosphorylating itself. And therefore it becomes on because the phosphate group remains on the insulin receptor.
But I think that the takeaway here is a little bit of reactive oxygen species in the form of hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2 generally, is needed to turn off that enzyme so that insulin receptor can be phosphorylated, can maintain a state of phosphorylation.
Right.
And a whole lot of reactive oxygen species will turn the insulin receptor off by kind of a similar mechanism. Now, we step back a little bit further into the cell. We're at the cell surface now. Let's go deeper into the cell. Where are these reactive oxygen species coming from? They're coming from a couple different places. They can come from peroxisomes. Mm-hmm. We're not really going to go into peroxisomes today. We're mostly going to focus on them coming from mitochondria.
Yes.
These are primordial bacteria, you guys. Nature is amazing. It is elegant and beautiful. And if nothing else, after this podcast, I want you to go home and just think about how incredibly complex your biology is at every moment, and take a deep breath and appreciate the fact you are alive, and hug your children or your spouse, your grandparents, because life is beautiful and this is incredibly complex. But we go deeper into the cell. We look at the mitochondria. This is where we're going to focus on the reactive oxygen species coming from.
Yes.
So let's talk about how different fatty acids affect reactive oxygen species formation in the mitochondria, or glucose.
Yeah.
Let's start with fatty acids.
All right, so I like to think of this, and I told Paul this analogy on the phone. I like to think of so there's this thing called the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, and this is another example of brilliant, amazing biology that's kind of hard to explain. But what happens is, as substrate, whether it's fat or carbohydrates, are being oxidized in the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle or the citric acid cycle. It has a lot of different names. Basically what's happening is electrons are being offloaded from the carbohydrates, and they're being moved to molecules that are electron carriers like NADH and this other one called FADH2. And those things are handing those electrons to these proteins in the wall of the mitochondria.
So we're inside the mitochondria. The mitochondria has two membranes.
Right.
It's a double membrane, which actually suggests that it was a bacteria that had a membrane that got engulfed by our membrane. So it has two membranes. In the inner membrane is the electron transport chain. We are in the inner sanctum. We are in the mitochondrial matrix, the very inner part of the mitochondria, where the Krebs cycle, aka TCA cycle, is happening.
Yes.
And it's handing off electrons in NADH and FADH2 to the electron transport chain.
Exactly. And so what happens is, so these electrons have a lot of electropotential energy. They have a voltage. And so what happens is they get passed essentially within that cell membrane of the mitochondria. There's a bunch of embedded proteins. And what's happening is the proteins are handing the electron from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And as they do that, they use the stored potential electron in that electron to pump protons across that mitochondrial membrane. And so what you have is you have a growing positive charge outside of the membrane and a negative charge on the inside of the mitochondrial membrane. And that creates essentially a battery. You've got a voltage difference from one side to the other. And then there's this, perhaps the craziest protein of all. This would be ATP synthetase. And so the ATP synthetase is this giant whirling motor essentially. And the protons can flow back through the ATP synthetase back into the mitochondria. And since there's a voltage differential there, they want to do that. And so this thing is literally spinning, and it's actually literally somehow using the mechanical energy of its spinning to convert ADP, adenosine diphosphate, into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the ATP is what most of our muscles use, and most of our body processes use in general. So that's kind of how the electron transport chain works in a nutshell to produce energy from fat, or
carbohydrate,
or ethanol, but here's where it gets even crazier. I like to think of it as this electron transport chain is like kind of a highway with multiple on-ramps. And so the NADH offloads its electrons onto like the first on-ramp.
It's like a bus. It's a certain bus.
Yeah.
And it gets off at the first one, which is called complex 1.
Exactly.
And then FADH2.
FADH2 drops its electron cargo off, feeds it into the system at the second on-ramp. What is it? Succinate. Complex 2, we'll call it succinate dehydrogenase, I think, but complex 2. And so,
which is associated with a coenzyme Q10. Coenzyme Q.
And so both complex 1 and complex 2 feed their electrons next to this coenzyme Q. And so the problem is, you've got two on-ramps, but they both have to go through this same coenzyme Q. And so you've got a bottleneck situation where if all of the electrons are entering the thing through complex 1, if they're all on NADH and they're going in through complex 1, the electrons flow straight through. There's no problems. There's no bottlenecks. No reactive oxygen species are generated. But the more that you feed things in through the second on-ramp and everything's got to get through coenzyme Q, now you get this bottleneck effect. And there's just simply too many electrons for coenzyme Q to carry. And when that happens, some of those electrons ping back out of the system.
They do what's called reverse electron transport.
That's right, reverse electron transport.
We're at a quantum level right now, guys. The electrons can go the wrong direction.
Right. And so now you've just got this free floating electron in floating around, and it's
on complex 1.
It ends up back in the mitochondrial solution. What's it called? It goes back out through complex 1 into the cytosol, I guess.
Have you seen the actual the post on protons about complex 1 and how it has this moiety? It's like the 1A, the NA1, the N1A. There's a part of this complex 1
I don't remember that one specifically.
Yeah. So there's a part of the complex 1 where this is what's so incredible about biology, you guys. And it appears that if you can get an electron onto a certain part of this complex 1, it just sits out there on this special part of that complex. And I'll find the name of it in a second. And it's waiting for the reactive oxygen species to become hydrogen peroxide.
Right.
So it kind of like holds it out, right? This extra electron forms a superoxide.
Right, it forms superoxide.
Superoxide, which then becomes hydrogen peroxide. So if you get electron, basically what we're saying is, I told you guys this is going to be technical. I told you. If you get reverse electron transport, because there are electrons coming into the system through FADH2 in the setting of a reduced coenzyme Q couple, and there are electrons going through NADH, you get the bottleneck, the electrons reverse back, and then you get superoxide created, and this is where we're getting reactive oxygen species. This is hydrogen peroxide.
Exactly. And so the more take-home message is, the more input into the electron transport chain through FADH2, the more hydrogen peroxide is going to build up in the cell. That's kind of the take-home message. We could get very deep into redox biology, but I don't It's probably not necessary.
So there's the superoxide is generated at a complex 1 of the mitochondria. There's an iron sulfur cluster. It's called N1A. It's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. It's just biology is brilliant and beautiful. It's the N1A portion of complex 1. And so let's just do like biochemistry 101, you guys. You eat carbohydrates, you eat glucose, you eat fructose. Most of the fructose gets converted to glucose. Those end up in our cells. If insulin signals, they come into the cell. And in the cytoplasm is where we do glycolysis. Glycolysis converts glucose to pyruvate. Pyruvate generally gets into the mitochondria and is used as acetyl-CoA. And the acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle, right? Acetyl-CoA combines with oxaloacetate to form citrate, goes into the Krebs cycle. Acetyl-CoA is kind of the central point, the node. If we metabolize fats, you can take fats from the cytoplasm, move those across the mitochondrial membrane. They get oxidized, beta oxidation process, and that can become acetyl-CoA, which enters the Krebs cycle. The difference is the amount of NAD and FADH2 that are produced when you oxidize glucose to pyruvate to acetyl-CoA versus when you oxidize a fat. And the ratio between FADH2 and NADH is called the F to N ratio. And so the idea here is that the higher your FADH2 to NADH ratio, the more superoxide is produced because you're getting more of those electrons offloaded at the second on-ramp.
Yes.
Causing a blockage, causing reverse electron transport, causing an extra electron at N1A, leading to superoxide, leading to hydrogen peroxide. What does this all mean? If you guys are still listening, bear with me. I always try and bring it back. I never forget you guys. I always bring it back. This is what Brad and I are talking about. This is where it all comes together. Saturated fat has a higher F to N ratio than polyunsaturated fat. And it's higher based on the number of unsaturations in the molecule, such that the F to N ratio of linoleic acid is lower than the F to N ratio produced when you have a saturated fat. So what we're saying is saturated fats generate more reactive oxygen species. There are so many studies to support this notion now. It's crazy.
Absolutely.
Glucose itself purely has an F to N ratio of 0.2. Stearic acid has an F to N ratio of 0.5. So there's a big difference here. And that is essentially talking about the amount of reactive oxygen species. Now, there's some nuance. It appears that tons of glucose can also do FADH2. We're not really going to go into that today.
There's a lot of different on-ramps so that all lead to this CoQ couple. So if in different scenarios, different things can make reactive oxygen species, essentially through the same way by overloading this bottleneck. But the basic one between saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat and glucose, I think, is the most important, at least for this discussion.
And so what we're talking about here, saturated fat equals more reactive oxygen species, especially at the level of the adipocyte, which makes the adipocyte insulin resistant because that superoxide becomes hydrogen peroxide, turns off the insulin receptor on the surface of the adipocyte. The adipocyte doesn't grow.
The adipocyte doesn't grow, and in fact, it shrinks because it's feeding fat to the rest of the body, and you're not hungry because you have high circulating free fatty acids, and your hypothalamus interprets that as, oh, there's lots of food available. I'm not going to signal hunger.
And there's ROS produced in the hypothalamus as well because the saturated fats are there. So we're linking together, guys, the molecular structure of different fats and the amount of reactive oxygen species produced. This is essentially what the protons thread is about. Brad and I both think it should be called the electrons thread because we're talking about electrons and we're talking about superoxide. Biology is the movement of electrons. Every single one of you listening to this is alive because of electrons moving in your body. This is beautiful. It's
Absolutely.
So amazing. But there are different signaling molecules. And this is why I have a big problem with calories in, calories out. Linoleic acid and stearic acid are both 18 carbon fats. They are 9 calories per gram, canonically speaking. They do completely different things to our biology.
Yes.
They are not the same in our biology. Brad and I talked about that at a higher level earlier. I want to go on a little bit of a side about metformin, and then we'll keep going, you guys, and talk about some studies. This may help illustrate it. Feel free to chime in here if you want with the metformin stuff.
Go with it. You're more familiar with this than I am.
So metformin is a complex 1 inhibitor. And there's theories about the actual mechanism of metformin. It appears to shut down gluconeogenesis in the liver. We know that metformin has actually been used to treat autoimmune disease. Metformin is also, it improves the metabolic dysfunction in diabetics. It's probably our most powerful drug.
And it's a naturally occurring compound, which is cool.
Yeah, it's from the French lily. I would say it's a plant toxin, and it'll kill you if you have too much of it. Metformin produces lactic acidosis because it's a partial and usually low levels of lactic acidosis, and it can cause B12 deficiency, incidentally. Metformin is a partial complex 1 inhibitor. If complex 1 is shut down, you cannot move NADH through the electron transport chain, which means that you are completely dependent on fatty acid oxidation. You can't move NADH. You can't use glycolysis to generate the reducing equivalents that are going to move through complex 1. You can't do glycolysis. So if you can't do glycolysis, your body makes pyruvate, and that pyruvate becomes lactate. Okay?
Yes.
You get lactate dehydrogenase, the pyruvate becomes lactate, which is why lactate is elevated on metformin. What we also know about metformin is metformin generates superoxide. You and I were looking at this paper before.
Yes.
Metformin generates reactive oxygen species. Why does it do this? We think it does this because at the level of the adipocyte, it forces an insulin-sensitive adipocyte to become insulin resistant and to use the fatty acids that are stored within that adipocyte to burn for fuel. And if you burn the fats that are in that adipocyte, you suddenly raise the F to N ratio, and that adipocyte becomes insulin resistant. It refuses insulin, and the adipocyte stops growing, and it stops releasing free fatty acids. One of the things we know, and I've talked about this on previous podcasts, is that if your adipocytes are spewing free fatty acids, if they're spewing too many of them, that can be a signal for the rest of the body to become metabolically dysfunctional. This is what we see with monogenic insulin resistance and familial hypolipodystrophy, or just familial lipodystrophy. So metformin appears to potentially force our fat cells to burn the fat within them. Instead of, taking in fat from the circulation, metformin appears to force our adipocytes to digest themselves because complex 1 is blocked. It's a very fascinating mechanism. It makes your adipocytes insulin...
complex 1 is partially blocked.
Partially blocked,
And
exactly.
so I think it does allow enough flow of electrons to overload the bottleneck in the presence of a lot of NADH2. Because if you completely blocked it, I think 1, you'd be dead because I think that would be rotenone.
That's rotenone.
2, but 2, to create the ROS, you have to allow some electrons in through complex 1. But
partially block it, kind of shuts it down. That's why lactate goes up.
Also, I want to make a quick point about, this is a little bit of a tangent, but you were talking about how in diabetes, you've got this unrestrained flow of free fatty acids, and that's where people talk about the energy toxicity of kind of type 2 diabetes. And that's actually what I'm sort of trying to mimic in my recent diet is like, but this is an important point though, right? So that would be in a type 2 diabetic, what you have is you have unrestrained flow of free fatty acids in the presence of lots of insulin trying to signal
to stop it.
Right.
Because the role of insulin is to stop lipolysis. So the end result of this, guys, if you follow this long term, linoleic acid signals to the adipocyte to grow. Eventually, that adipocyte, as it's insulin sensitive, it runs into a problem where it is so full that it starts spewing out fatty acids. And this is adipocyte triglyceride lipase, ATGL. And so the theory here is that when the adipocytes get overfull, I think especially the visceral adipose tissue, we get a release, an inadvertent release of fats. And the inadvertent release of those fats is then signaling to the rest of the body, hey, become insulin resistant, but it's a pathological situation because there is energy overload. There's energy everywhere. There's high glucose, high insulin, high free fatty acids. Because the adipocytes are poisoned with too much linoleic acid, they have grown so big that they cannot possibly hold it anymore. They're just leaking it. And I imagine that in that situation, the ratio of free fatty acids in the blood changes. And we know that the ratio of fatty acids in the blood can affect the way the periphery responds to the signals from the adipocytes.
Right.
We're getting pretty deep in the rabbit hole right now, guys. I hope you're still with us. I'm going to try and keep you with us.
Should we move to the Spanish study about the butter, because that is about free fatty acids, which sort of flows from what we're talking about right now?
Yeah, I just want to contrast metformin.
Yeah.
Metformin makes your adipocytes insulin resistant. So metformin is kind of like stearic acid in some ways, not totally. But metformin works in diabetes, I think, because it makes your adipocytes insulin resistant. I don't want you to take metformin. I think we should stop eating linoleic acid and start eating animal fats, right? And animals nose to tail. Get the organs too, because you need all the nutrients in the organs to do all the biochemistry to make all this happen. You need the riboflavin, you need the folate, you need the choline, you need the carnitine. This is why I'm such a huge fan of eating nose to tail. Shout out to Heart and Soil. Check us out if you guys need organ complex supplements. The opposite of metformin is thiazolidinediones. These are glitazones, pioglitazone, rosiglitazone. If you guys know people on these medications, they make you fat because they cause the adipocyte to remain insulin sensitive. So these two drugs really illustrate what Brad and I are talking about here. You want to be metabolically healthy, have insulin-resistant adipocytes. You can fake it with metformin, which is going to have all sorts of bad side effects, or you can achieve it by eating like your ancestors. You can lower the glucose in your bloods temporarily with thiazolidinediones, and you will worsen your underlying metabolic dysfunction. These are horrible drugs. They should never be used. They completely miss the point. Rosiglitazone, pioglitazone, this is Avandia and Actos. They completely miss the point of what we're trying to do here. Okay, with that said,
that's cool.
Let's just give a quick summary for people at this point. We'll take a breath. I'll give a quick summary, and then we will move on to the butter study. What we are saying is that at the level, and you can correct me and I'll let you add anything to this, at the level of the mitochondria, this is where insulin resistance starts. Insulin resistance is a normal process that can go wrong when there is too much linoleic acid in our body. Linoleic acid, polyunsaturated fats signal to our mitochondria that reactive oxygen species are a signal that reactive oxygen species should not be produced. The cells remain insulin sensitive. This can be misconstrued in the short term, but at the level of the adipocyte, it means those grow and eventually they get pathologically large, which causes major problems. The reverse is saturated fat, which has a higher F to N ratio because of beta oxidation, the FADH2 to NADH, and that causes our adipocytes to become insulin resistant. They don't grow, they never expand, you never get to this pathological spewing of free fatty acids, which essentially leads to underlying metabolic dysfunction. So we're wrapping it all in here. There's a whole nother part of linoleic acid that I'll save for another podcast with Tucker Goodrich. Talked about this a little bit with Tommy Wood. The other problem with linoleic acid is oxalams, oxidative products of linoleic metabolism. The fact that linoleic acid is known to break down into 4-hydroxynonenal, 9 and 13-HOD, and these create major problems for us as well. It's probably all linked here, but we'll probably touch on some of that as well. So with all of that in mind, okay, glycolysis, electron transport chain, mitochondria signaling to the cell, whether it should be insulin resistant or insulin sensitive, the adipocyte-centric model of insulin resistance, or at least metabolic dysfunction. Let's talk about the Spanish study with butter. Why don't you walk us through it?
Actually, as soon as you started saying that, I was like, no, maybe we should talk about the nematodes first.
Let's talk about C. elegans.
Let's talk about C. elegans. So the reason I like this paper so much is it shows that, you know, this thing that we're talking about, the FADH to NADH ratio, the F to N ratio, isn't some like modern, like Peter's off on some tangent somewhere. This is something we just came up with.
Evolutionarily conserved.
The C. elegans paper shows that this switch has been in place in biology for 1 billion years, going all the way back to a tiny worm called a nematode, which lives in the soil, and they have like 24 cells, right? So this thing is ancient switch that linoleic acid breaks, right? So we have the switch that is, I mean, literally, since the time of nematodes, this is what your basic biology has relied on as a cue to, are we burning fat or are we burning glucose? And linoleic acid actually breaks that very fundamental biological switch. And so here's what happens with the nematodes. If you starve a nematode of glucose, it will be forced to burn its own fat. And of course, when it does that, it creates a higher FADH2 to NADH ratio. If you're a nematode, when you see these reactive oxygen species being produced now, because the exact same reason, they have a mitochondria too. When they start burning fat, there's more reactive oxygen species. The nematode sees this and says, uh-oh, I'm not in an environment that is energy rich because nematodes are typically looking for glucose. They're looking for sugar coming off plant roots in the soil. So their main source of food they're going to find is going to be glucose or some kind of starch. And so they say, okay, we're burning fat. That's a bad sign. This is not a good time to reproduce. And so what happens is they end up living a few days longer. Now, nematodes don't live very long. They live something like 18 days. And so if you deprive them to glucose, their life will be like 21 or 22 days, right? Not even that much longer. But from the perspective of the nematode, that gives them a few days longer to find a good source of glucose. And then when they find the glucose, they'll switch out of fat metabolism. They'll burn the glucose and they say, okay, we've got lots of energy. This is a good time to breed, right? And so that shows how that switch works. The ROS is telling them not much energy around. Don't reproduce. Wait a few days till you find some, right?
And it speaks to the evolutionary conservation of this. There's a lot of studies we're going to talk about that are in mouse models. And lest anyone think that mice models are not relevant here, we are talking about fundamentally conserved electron transport chain in the mitochondria. There's potentially nothing more evolutionarily conserved at this, which is why mouse models are actually, I think, really valuable here.
Sure.
Some things are not super valuable. Well, there are some biochemistry between murine mouse and rat models that are not conserved in humans.
Absolutely.
But at the mitochondrial level, the electron transport chain and the effects of different fatty acids are highly conserved.
Absolutely. And so the last part of the nematode study is pretty neat. So what happens is if you deprive them of glucose and you give them a powerful antioxidant, the antioxidant essentially mops up those reactive oxygen species and they will live their normal lifespan. They'll go back to only living 18 days. The reason that they don't, and so that shows that the actual mechanism that's giving them that 3-day life extension is the reactive oxygen species. Because if you mop those up with an antioxidant, they don't know they're burning fat. I'm just going to rephrase that. If the mitochondria isn't producing hydrogen peroxide, the organism doesn't know that it's burning fat. That's an important sentence, I think.
Yeah. And another thing to note, guys, is that reactive oxygen species, superoxide, is a signal for mitochondrial biogenesis. This has been talked of as mitohormesis. That when we do this, when the mitochondria see reactive oxygen species, that is a signal for mitochondria to grow and divide and make more mitochondria. We'll talk about a study maybe in a moment in which humans are deprived of stearic acid and their mitochondria fragment and turn off. And you give the humans back stearic acid, the mitochondria fuse, they turn on and they start burning fat and they start multiplying. So mitochondrial biogenesis is a good thing. Reactive oxygen species are a good thing. The second study in that post is really cool. Why don't you talk about that vitamin C and E and exercise study? Do you remember that one?
Yeah. So this is a study.
Same idea in humans.
It's the same idea in humans. I don't remember all the details of the paper, but basically, they had two groups of, I think it was healthy men, and they put them both on an exercise regime that they followed. And one group was given a bunch of antioxidants, as I believe vitamin A and vitamin C, or vitamin C and vitamin E. And at the end of the exercise regime, the group of people that were given the vitamin C and the vitamin E, aka antioxidants, aka things that mop up reactive oxygen species, they couldn't find any benefit in those people from having done the exercise and the metrics that they tested, which were things about, they were actually testing, ironically, for insulin sensitivity, but I can't remember if you remember the other things they tested for, but... Yeah,
I think they tested for perhaps aerobic capacity or muscle strength or insulin sensitivity, but none of the benefits were seen.
Yeah, so you can eliminate the benefits of exercise simply by taking an antioxidant. In C. elegans worms and in people, the fact that the antioxidants can do these things shows that it really is the hydrogen peroxide, the reactive oxygen species that are, that really is the signal that is having all of these important fundamental biological effects.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I just find this interesting because so many people now will megadose vitamin C.
Yeah.
Do you really want to do that?
And vitamin E too.
Yeah, horrible idea. You don't have the full spectrum of tocopherols. Like, I've always said that I think we can get plenty of vitamin C from animal foods eaten nose to tail, you guys. And I think that a lot of people are megadosing and overdosing of vitamin C, and there's a real negative effect here.
And the way that your body, and I've got a whole post on this on Fire in a Bottle. It's called like Meet Your Antioxidant System and how it's regulated. But so if you take, so your body has a very potent antioxidant system. If it didn't,
glutathione.
Glutathione is called the body's master antioxidant. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't be able to live in an oxygen atmosphere because oxygen is very corrosive. That's why metal rusts. That's why things catch on fire, right? Like, so it's not that these reactive oxygen species aren't without some amount of danger, but our body has cleverly learned to use oxygen as this signaling molecule because our body understands that, oxygen is this very active molecule. It wants to take electrons. And so our body is used to learn it. You're used to learn it as a signal, which is really smart. But the way that your body responds to taking a lot of something like vitamin C or vitamin E is by making less glutathione. Because what the body is trying to achieve is it's trying to achieve balance. The body doesn't want too many reactive oxygen species, but it also doesn't want too little. And so it's trying to stay right in the middle. And so if you give it lots of antioxidants, the body will just make less of its own. That's how it responds because it wants to see balance. So if you overload on antioxidants, your body just makes less to try to achieve balance. That's what it is. And there's another, I have another post about that that's fairly recent. And I can't remember what it's called, but it's the mechanism by which the body is trying to stay in the middle of that antioxidant spectrum. So, I mean, and conversely, if you eat a lot, if you do things like eat tons of stearic acid, your body will also respond to that in time by making more antioxidants. And so sometimes that's why I think, when you do certain diets, I think it makes sense to do it in a sort of pulsed fashion because your body is very clever about changing the amount of antioxidants to balance the system over time. But that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, and you guys can read my book, The Carnivore Code. Check out my discussions of environmental hormesis. I think that this is all, we've talked about it all previously. So let's talk about the butter study and some of these mouse studies, because there's some pretty incredible studies in mice looking at the way that mice respond to linoleic acid versus stearic acid. Let's talk about the butter experiment.
Yeah, so the butter experiment I think is really cool. And this really gets at, I think, a lot of the things that Paul and I have been talking about. So what they did, I believe this was done in Spain, and they fed people mixed meals of carbohydrate and fat. And they either got butter as the fat, or I believe they got olive oil, or the third group was like a really weird, it was like some combination of like vegetable oil and fish oil or something. So like very, very unsaturated fat. And so what happens is when you eat a mixed fuel meal, including fat and starch, you produce insulin. What does the insulin do? Insulin tells fat cells to stop doing lipolysis, which is to say, insulin says, okay, fuel's available. Fat cells, you don't need to feed the body with fat right now because we have this source of fuel. And so that happens. And then over time, as that insulin signal fades, as it becomes hours after the meal, what happens is the fat cells will steadily start releasing free fatty acids into the bloodstream again as a source of fuel. And what happened in this experiment is that the group of people that were given starch and butter, their free fatty acid levels from the adipocytes didn't drop as much in the first place, and they rebounded faster after the meal compared to the group given olive oil, and especially compared to the group given the vegetable oil and fish oil. And so, if you think about when people have you have a mixed meal, And then 3 or 4 hours after the meal, that's when you get that hypoglycemic and people get hungry again, and they get, even hungrier than they were before they ate. So if you eat starch with margarine, what's going to happen is that, sure, your blood sugar will go up initially, but your free fatty acids are going to drop. And as your starch comes back down, your free fatty acids are still down here. And so now you're hungry. Your blood sugar, right? So now you're starting to get lower blood sugar, or possibly lower than it was, or back to normal blood sugar at least. But before the meal, your free fatty acids were up here. Now, because your adipocytes are insulin sensitive because of the vegetable oil, your free fatty acids are still down here. But if you ate the bread with butter, the same thing happens with blood glucose. But as the blood glucose comes down, the free fatty acids, because the adipocytes are now insulin resistant, the free fatty acids released by the adipocytes rebound faster. So by the time your blood glucose drops, your free fatty acids are already back to baseline, or in fact, in the butter study, it was even higher. Free fatty acids were higher than before the meal. So the saturated fat caused free fatty acids to bounce back a lot quicker from the meal. And that, I believe, is attributable. That's what causes long-term satiation. So that's when you see, French people eating croissants. Americans think that if you eat starch with fat, that 3 or 4 hours later, you're going to be hypoglycemic, you're going to be hungry again. And that's what gets you on this roller coaster towards ultimately developing diabetes. And so what I always go back to is, well, what about the traditional French diet? And I believe this Spanish paper really goes a long way towards explaining why the French don't snack. They have their croissant or their bread and butter in the morning, and very quickly with the butter, their free fatty acids rebound. And so they don't snack because they're not hungry, right? Because they've eaten saturated fat. Whereas an American
croissant is going to be made with canola oil,
right? Or if they have toast, they're going to put margarine on it, or all the different things, or they're going to eat it with bacon, which is full of PUFA, or they're going to put some weird non-dairy creamer in their coffee, which is made of soybean oil, or all of the other. Or the bread itself is going to be made with soybean oil. So we have all these additional sources of polyunsaturated fats. And so when we eat a mixed meal of starch and fat, we're hungry because our adipocytes are insulin sensitive. That's why we're hungry 4 hours after a mixed fat and carbohydrate meal.
And if you look at the Spanish paper as well, the triglycerides stayed higher in the people who ate the butter meal. So the triglycerides are probably a combination of, they're mostly going to come from the chylomicrons in the stomach of the people who are eating the meal. And you can see the triglycerides stay elevated longer. People might say, oh, that's bad, triglycerides. These are postprandial triglycerides, guys. Fasting triglycerides elevated are usually a marker of metabolic dysfunction, but postprandial, after eating triglycerides, are going to be a marker of fat utilization, and the fact that the triglycerides remain in your blood because they're not going into your fat cells.
Exactly.
They're getting used by peripheral cells for energy. So you want your triglycerides to stay higher in the blood because they're not going to your fat cells. You still want your fasting triglycerides after 14 or 16 hours on your lipid panel to be within normal. But this is why you must look at fasting triglycerides, not postprandial triglycerides, because in all healthy adults, postprandial triglycerides are going to be elevated because that's normal human physiology.
And this is exactly what I talked about earlier with the feasting mimicking diet. I'm trying to do everything possible to keep all of the fuel sources available in my bloodstream to my cells because I'm trying to lose weight without hunger. And I don't want, right? I want circulating triglycerides. I want circulating free fatty acids. I want circulating glucose. I want circulating ketones.
Bro, why can't we just get you on a nose-tail carnivore diet? I'm telling you, you're going to lose more weight than this.
So
talk about the carbs.
So a couple of things. So one,
you definitely need organs. You definitely need liver.
All right. Okay. First off, I did the initial croissant diet with liverwurst on the croissants because at the time I was the irony of all this, I'm the one promoting eating white flour because
I'm not a fan of this.
I'm the one who was the nose to tail butcher for 15 years. So that's the irony of it. I made liverwurst and pate and have been like pushing it on my customers for years. But I'm doing this because I'm interested in, I'm simply interested in the food history of it. And I want to show that it really is the linoleic acid and not the carbohydrates, right?
Right.
And so that's why I'm eating the carbohydrates, is because I want to
lose weight eating carbohydrates.
I want to show that you can lose weight eating carbohydrates, because I believe that after reading the hyperlipid blog, and as I say, it solved the cognitive dissonance that I've had. There was a time I remember I was in my 20s and I had just lost a bunch of weight doing pretty strict keto. And we went to a conference in the Virgin Islands, which was awesome. But I remember there was a ton of Europeans there. And I had just lost all this weight eating totally keto. And there's all these Europeans there, and they're all slender. And we all ate at the same, cafeteria at this resort that we were at, right? And I just watched every morning they would all go up to the breakfast thing, and they would just get like baguettes. They would just load their plate up with with bread, and then they would just all smother butter and cheese on it, and they would go back and they would eat it all. And I was just sitting there like, why are they all so skinny? From my American perspective, I'm like, they should all be fat. Like, I'm watching what they're eating, and I can see them, and they're all slender and healthy looking. Like, what is going on here? And so that's the cognitive dissonance that I've carried around all of these years until I finally read Hyperlip and sort of put it together. And that's why I'm doing it with the croissants. And of course, I believe in eating organ meats, and I believe in eating connective tissues. And I love pig skin as much as the next guy. A few years ago, I was making, I got into a habit of, we were taking pork trotters, and I was like roasting the whole pork trotter, and we were just eating all the skin and the cartilage and oh my God, it was so good. And I want to get back to doing that once I have low PUFA pigs again from Firebrand Meats. And I actually just made, I was just stayed with Amber O'Hearn for a couple of days, and I was actually looking for beef suet in Boulder, Colorado, which was surprisingly difficult to find. I was surprised. And
Firestarter, you guys, Firestarter.
Yeah. And so I went to this Mexican market and thinking they would have beef suet, and they didn't, but they had a meat counter. And I walked in, and they had not one, but two kinds of tripe, two different grades of tripe. And they had beef knuckles, these knuckly beef things, and they had a beef tongue. And so I was like, okay, all bets are off. We're making menudo. And I actually made a carnivore version of menudo for Amber and for Siobhan Huggins, and that was great. So a lot of fun. So I love nose to tail meat eating, to be clear, even though I'm doing this fun croissant and French fries stunt at the moment.
So you know that tripe actually has BPC 157 in it. So there's a peptide.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so
I don't even know what that is.
It's a peptide that's been involved in like muscle regeneration and wound healing and stuff. So at Heart and Soil, we're coming out with a gut and digestion capsule. Tripe is really hard to get, but we're going to put tripe and intestines and stuff in there. But tripe and intestine are valuable for BPC 157. It's just the value of getting nose to tail. So check out gut and digestion, you guys. I do want to mention just my perspective on wheat. I'm not a fan of this, you guys. I got to get you the part of my book about wheat germ agglutinin. There's actually a blog on hyperlipid that I was reading today, which corroborated something that I wrote in the book. There is good evidence that wheat germ agglutinin will also completely mess up your insulin signaling. So I think that maybe there's something different about European wheat than American wheat. I just know that you will be better without wheat. I appreciate what you're doing. I want you guys to know the Croissant Diet doesn't require carbs, doesn't require wheat. But Brad is showing that you can lose weight eating carbs. He is showing that carbs don't cause diabetes or weight loss, that it is about the fats you're eating, the stearic acid, the linoleic acid. Let's get back to some of these mouse studies.
Yes.
So you want to talk about Valerie Reeves, PhD, and the nude athymic mice study?
Yeah, and so Valerie Reeves, and I wish I've been bombing across the country, so I haven't had a ton of time immediately before this to reread some of these papers. So I apologize if I get some of the results wrong. But so Valerie Reeves' thesis, yeah, she was feeding different groups of mice, these nude mice, and I don't know if
there's 2 studies.
Yeah, there's a couple. I'm spacing mildly, but some of them were given essentially starch with, I believe it was a 40% of total fat, and most of that was stearic acid, versus the other ones. Do you remember the fat breakdowns on the other diets?
I forget. I know there's a polyunsaturated and a monounsaturated.
Right.
Both the studies are pretty similar.
There was a monounsaturated, a polyunsaturated, and a stearic acid. And in that study, the stearic acid mice by far weighed the least and had especially the least amount of kidney fat. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe in her thesis that was true in wild type mice as well as in the nude mice. I think in the wild, she did wild type mice, and wild type mice are hard to make fat. And so in a lot of the obesity studies, they use all these other kind of weird mice that are very prone to obesity. And I think in her paper, even in wild type mice, when she gave them the starch and the stearic acid, they lost abdominal fat and they lost weight.
Yeah, and there was another study that I've spoken about a lot recently. And again, remember, guys, these mechanisms appear to be very evolutionarily conserved. We're talking about the electron transport chain of the mitochondria. And in the second study, they did use nude athymic mice, which is part of the breast cancer model, a metastatic breast cancer model. But they had 3 groups, a stearic acid group, a corn oil group, and an oleic acid safflower group. And they show you in the paper the amount of visceral fat on these mice.
Yeah.
And it is striking. The stearic acid mice have a 6-pack. And the corn oil group and the safflower oil group have a lot of visceral fat.
Yeah.
And we know that visceral fat in humans and probably in mice correlates negatively with insulin sensitivity and metabolic dysfunction.
Right. And I'll say that all of these studies that we're talking about are actually, if you go to Fire in a Bottle and you look for the ROS theory of obesity, these all came out of that series. That was the series that I wrote before I started the Croissant Diet, sort of as a preview of it. So if you want to check out any of these papers, just Google for the ROS theory of obesity and start with the first post, and you can click through and see all of these papers on there.
We'll put them all in the show notes too, guys, which will be at heartandsoilsupplements.com. Okay, so those are fascinating. We talked a little bit about the ROS, satiety, and anandamide study. That was a study in which they gave mice linoleic acid. They saw them get fat, and they saw anandamide and endogenous and endocannabinoids go up. Let's talk about the body fat of obese adults study. This is an SCD1 study. So this one's pretty interesting too.
Yeah. And so this is a study where they looked at a couple of things. They looked at, they took a group of non-obese adults, and then they looked at morbidly obese adults, people who are very fat, and they looked at the amount of polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fat in their fat stores. And what they found was that, the obese people had significantly less saturated fat, more monounsaturated fat, and more polyunsaturated fat than the normal weight people. So here's an example of okay, it shows that yes, on average, obese people have way more unsaturated fats, both polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats, and they have less saturated fats, which is to say that they have a lower F to N ratio. And that, I think, that sort of is like, okay, can we show an effect in actual humans? And it's like, okay, well, let's look at obese humans and see what's different about them. And it's like, yep, they have more polyunsaturated fat and they have more monounsaturated fat. They also have higher levels. What the study is really about is this enzyme called SCD1. And what SCD1 does is it converts saturated fats to monounsaturated fats. So humans cannot make polyunsaturated fats, but we can make saturated fats, or we can get saturated fats from our diet. And once we've gotten them, we can convert them to monounsaturated fats. The enzyme that does that is called SCD1. And it turns out that obese people make a lot more of this protein than do lean people. And so the obese people were presumably eating more polyunsaturated fat because they have more polyunsaturated fat, and the only way you can get that from the diet. But they're also making this enzyme that's unsaturating their saturated fat into monounsaturated fat. So they're doing two different things.
Which is lowering their F to N ratio.
They're doing two different things that's lowering their F to N ratio.
Which is causing the adipocytes to remain more insulin sensitive and probably grow.
Yes.
Which is how it all relates back. So that's fascinating. And remember, like Brad is saying, the only way you get polyunsaturated fat in your fat is when you eat it.
Yes.
So again, morbidly obese people have more polyunsaturated fat. Interesting correlation there. We can understand how that all works when we think about the protons theory of disease. I referred to a study earlier that I want to reiterate here, which is that in humans, we can deprive them of stearic acid. They put them on 2 days of a vegan diet, a low-fat vegan diet.
Yes.
And their mitochondria change. The mitochondria stop working.
The colloquially known banana milkshake study, I assume you're talking about.
The banana milkshake study. And so after 2 days of a low-fat vegan diet, which is low in stearic acid I really believe to be a nutrient that humans need, you guys, found in animal foods like suet. 2 days of a diet like that, and the mitochondria fragment, and they burn less fat. Fatty acylcarnitines in the blood go up because the body isn't using, they're not burning fat. They give them a banana milkshake full of stearic acid. Then they just gave them pure stearic acid, 26 grams of stearic acid. What do they see? They see the mitochondria fuse, turn back on, and acylcarnitines go down, suggesting the mitochondria start burning fat. You can see the pictures. Basically, this is where I got the name for Fire Starter for our supplement. Hat tip to Brad for fire in the bottle, but Fire Starter. You want to start a fire in your body? Give your body stearic acid. Now, you can get it from suet, you get it from other animal fat, you get it from cacao butter, but that's why we make the supplement at Heart and Soil, the Fire Starter supplement. So that's super cool. And that was an amazing experiment because you can show in humans, deprive them of stearic acid, mitochondria get screwed up, give them stearic acid, things get a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The other study I want to talk about is the one with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So there's a couple of interesting trials in humans that show that lowering the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, specifically by lowering linoleic acid, improves non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in kids, and another one that showed it improved outcomes in what is called AERD, aspirin exacerbated respiratory disease, which is also known as Samter's triad. It's nasal polyps, recurrent sinusitis, and sensitivity to aspirin in terms of asthma or other breathing problems. In both of these conditions, a low omega-6 diet with a moderate amount of omega-3, which we will get eating regular animal meat and organs, no need to supplement fish oil, improve these conditions. The non-alcoholic fatty liver disease study in kids is fascinating because these kids have metabolic dysfunction. And you limit linoleic acid, the kids don't lose weight, but they lose visceral adipose tissue and their insulin resistance markers improve and the hepatic fat fraction improves. So what are we saying here? We're saying this is really more evidence to support the claims that Brad and I are making that excess linoleic acid eventually leads to metabolic dysfunction, potentially so early that kids are getting this. If kids are getting fatty liver, they're really sick, and you can fix it not necessarily by restricting carbs, so that would help by changing the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. The best way to do that is to lower linoleic acid. I do not believe in excess omega-3 supplementation for a variety of reasons. Omega-3 can get oxidized, and there's a potential that too much omega-3 could also affect the F to N ratio, but that's a story for another day. So there's a lot of studies there. And I mean, if you guys are interested, you can read the Protons blog. It's literally dense as heck.
Yes.
It's dense as good pig fat. It's really solid stuff.
If you read, if you want to try to read the Protons thread, if you read On Fire in a Bottle, the series called Intro to Oxidation, and then the ROS Theory of Obesity, I call the ROS Theory of Obesity, I kind of jokingly, kind of not jokingly, call the layperson's guide to hyperlipid, because hyperlipid is so hard to get into. And so those two series introduce a lot of the basic concepts that is discussed on hyperlipid in a way that hopefully a lot more people can understand. And if you read those first and then try to read hyperlipid, I hope you'll have more success than just trying to jump in, because it's not easy stuff.
Or maybe just listen to this podcast and stop eating so much linoleic acid. I
mean, or you could do that too.
Unless you're a biochemist or you really are interested in this stuff, you could really just stop eating chicken and pork that's fed corn and soy. and eat nose-to-tail animal foods. That's pretty much what we're talking about here.
That's right. And I want to plug Firebrand Meats one more time. Firebrandmeats.com. We've got subscriptions. It's $99 a month. You get a box of awesome pork every month. This is heritage breed pork. It's from Berkshire. It's from Berkshire pigs, which are the best pork. They have like great marbling, great color. There's going to be like almost no polyunsaturated fat in this pork at all. I'm hoping it's going to be less than 5%, which is comparable to most beef fat, perhaps not the best grass-fed beef fat, but be comparable to any beef fat that you would get in a supermarket. And so, yeah, I'd love it if you want to share. It's going to be awesome stuff.
You should check it out, guys. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about, unless you have anything else, is you mentioned your fasting mimicking diet. Zac Efron, this is for you. There's been this Netflix series going around, and Zac Efron is using his star power to talk to people. He ends up talking to Walter Longo, and Walter Longo tells him about this epidemiology study that Walter Longo did using protein. And this study is ridiculous, you guys. I really want to break this down for you. Walter Longo has something called the fasting mimicking diet, which is just, in my opinion, kind of silly. He sells bars that are very expensive and have lots of processed sugar in them to get you to eat less calories. You could just eat less calories of healthy food. But in his epidemiology study, what you will find is that those who ate less protein under age 65 had better outcomes, but those who ate less protein over age 65 had worse outcomes. And this is the study that so many people cite, they're so ignorant, I guess, of the results, to say eating less protein is good for humans. And you think, how is that even possible? To me, this is just an artifact of epidemiology. As you all know, if you've read my book, The Carnivore Code, correlation does not causation make. We cannot draw causative inference for any epidemiology study to show one association below 65 and a different association over 65 in the direction that this one did, suggesting that more protein is better over 65. That makes absolutely no sense. That protein is bad for us when we're young and good for us when we're old. This makes no sense, you guys. Do not be fearful of protein lowering your lifespan. Do not believe Walter Longo's epidemiology. This makes me crazy. I will try to get him on the podcast, and I will debate him formally if you guys would like to see that. All right, so in summary, we have gone from Emmy's story, a woman struggling to lose weight on a carnivore diet, a ketogenic diet, including a lot of chicken and pork, changing the amount of linoleic acid in her diet, increasing the amount of stearic acid, seeing significant weight loss after a few weeks. That is really cool.
Yeah.
Brad's story, experiencing many similar things, using a high stearic acid butter with wheat, though it's not my favorite. It proves you can lose weight eating carbohydrates. We went through the ideas around why eliminating carbohydrates works on a ketogenic diet, but why it's only a short-term fix. Why the real issue is this linoleic acid. The linoleic acid is sending a signal from our mitochondria to our cells to remain insulin sensitive. And though this may sound good on the surface, in the adipocytes, it's a nightmare. And over time, you end up with broken metabolism. You want to change this. We got into a lot of the nitty-gritty details. We talked about FADH2. We talked about glycolysis, the electron transport chain. We talked about all these places in the electron transport chain that these reducing intermediates from the Krebs cycle deliver the electrons. We talked about reverse electron transport. We talked about complex 1, N1A, superoxide, hydrogen peroxide. We got into the weeds on this one, you guys. We talked about the insulin receptor and how that works. And we talked about a number of studies just from memory and just telling the results. We've seen studies in both humans and mice pretty clearly demonstrate that at the level...
And nematodes.
And nematodes and C. elegans, conserved over 1 billion years, show that saturated fats have a very significant effect on the mitochondria, and that linoleic acid has a different effect. So hopefully this all makes sense. Would you add anything to summarize that, Brad?
I feel like there's one topic that we hit a bunch of times from a different angle, and I just want to kind of summarize that. And this is the thing about the free fatty acids. So in the Spanish study and in the feasting mimicking diet that I'm doing, I'm saying that having high free fatty acids is a good thing because, and I'm saying that one of the reasons you want your adipocytes to be insulin resistant is a good thing because that means they're releasing free fatty acids. That means you have fat available to burn as fuel. But I just want to contrast that. The problem in type 2 diabetes is that you lose all ability to regulate your free fatty acids and you pump them out even in the presence of high insulin and high blood glucose. And that's when high free fatty acids become a problem. In the short term, so I noticed doing the fasting mimicking diet, I did a big feast meal. The next morning, my free fatty acids were well within the sort of normal physiological range. And so, and that's good, because having them around means that I'm not hungry, right? I've got my blood glucose, got all the things, I'm good, right? And the next day after fasting, in the sense of not eating anything that produced insulin, they were like through the roof. They went up to like 1300, which is like crazy high. But that always happens during a fast, is free fatty acids go up. And so free fatty acids being high is if you're relatively metabolically healthy, I think high free fatty acids is a good thing. It's a source of fuel. It means that your adipocytes are feeding the rest of the body. It means you're not hungry. It's actually a really good thing. It's only in the specific example of when your fat cells have lost all ability to regulate themselves and they're just spewing free fatty acids because they are literally physically incapable of holding anymore, and that other lipase is activated. That's when you get into type 2 diabetes and metabolic
dysfunction.
Yeah, and so I don't want people to think free fatty acids are bad, or that even really high free fatty acids aren't necessarily bad. It's context dependent. You don't want to see high free fatty acids after a meal, when there's lots of insulin around, and there's blood glucose and all these other forms of energy. But after that meal, you want your free fatty acids to bounce back relatively quickly, and that's why using butter, using very saturated fats is good, because it keeps your circulating energy levels high. As long as you're not, obese to the point that you can't hold any more fat, that's where it becomes a problem.
I think there's probably a difference in free fatty acids that are coming through the action of hormone-sensitive lipase, which is under the control of insulin, and free fatty acids that are coming from ATGL, adipocyte triglyceride lipase, which are two different enzymes. And the ATGL enzyme is probably the one that gets activated in the setting of extreme adipocyte overdistension. Yeah. And that doesn't happen because you're eating too much fat. It happens because you're eating too much linoleic acid.
Yeah.
So, there are some in the dietary world who would say that fat makes you fat, and that is not true. Because as we're seeing, stearic acid can make you quite thin. It can make mice quite thin. And that is a good thing. It is the type of fat you're eating. There is nuance there as well. People always ask me, should I not eat fat and carbohydrates together? You can definitely eat fat and carbohydrates together. Don't you dare eat linoleic acid ever, or eat linoleic acid and carbohydrates
Definitely
together.
Don't eat linoleic acid and carbohydrates together.
It's a horrible idea. Horrible idea. But another thing to come out of the podcast, though I am no fan of wheat because of, wheat germ agglutinin and many of the other lectins found in wheat, as I talk about in my book, The Carnivore Code, I do not think that carbohydrates cause insulin resistance. And the idea promulgated by many in the ketogenic community that carbohydrate signaling creates too much insulin and that leads to insulin resistance, that's ridiculous. In the very short term, lots of insulin can cause a cell to turn off when that cell is full. But I've never seen evidence that in an otherwise metabolically healthy person, a robust insulin signal from a carbohydrate-containing meal, presumably these carbohydrates are ancestrally consistent carbohydrates, things I would consider to be tier 1 carbohydrates in the carnivore code, fruit or honey, things like this, that is going to create a transient issue or a transient insulin triggered insulin sensitive resistance, but that's going to move away quickly and immediately. The only way that I could ever imagine someone becoming insulin resistant from carbohydrates is if they had an IV drip of Fritos. And there's an example people have asked me about. Said, what about Gary Taubes and the Pima? They eat a lot of carbohydrates and they're super insulin resistant. Well, guess what, you guys? The Pima also eat a crap load of linoleic acid because all the foods they're eating are cooked with vegetable oil. So show me the Pima Indian who is eating a lot of carbohydrates without vegetable oil. Show me that person and we will have something to talk about. Show me the amount of linoleic acid in their red blood cells. Show me the amount of linoleic acid in their bloodstream. Show me the amount of linoleic acid in their fat cells. And show me the amount of ROS they're generating. I do not believe that the Pima Indians would become insulin resistant with carbohydrates per se, especially if they were ancestrally consistent carbohydrates. I don't think you'd get somebody who is Pima, obese and diabetic with honey or fruit.
Yeah, and I think there are, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are Pima who are still living their ancestral diet, which is a high carbohydrate diet, but it's their old fashioned varieties of like corn and beans, and they're not supplementing with linoleic acid, and those might not be quote ideal ancestral types of carbohydrates, but I believe those PIMA do not have the same problems with obesity and diabetes as the ones who live in America and are given the standard American diet.
You ever heard of fry bread, you guys?
Yeah, that's
okay.
That's no bueno.
Fry bread is your metabolic nightmare. Fry bread is the opposite of suet. Fry bread is the opposite of fire starter. Fry bread is the opposite of stearic acid. It is wheat with linoleic acid, like wheat and vegetable oil, you guys. That is what they're eating.
So fry bread is probably from a macronutrient ratio is almost the same as a croissant. The only thing that's different is the type of oil, right? They're frying it in vegetable oil, and and Native Americans, as we know, have tons of issues with obesity and diabetes. Conversely, the French are eating, literally bread and butter and croissants and cheese on baguettes, and they stay lean. The only difference in those two diets, I mean, sure, possibly the French are getting more calcium or something, but the main difference in those two diets is the saturation level of the dietary fats.
And then we talked about the Chinese or Asian, people, Thai, who are all eating, a lot of rice and remaining lean often. And then I've been talking about a study recently with sumo wrestlers. And you can look at sumo wrestlers who eat a ton of freaking rice. And I'm not denying that caloric excess is going to cause obesity.
Sure.
You can eat 5,000 to 7,000 calories a day with rice as a sumo wrestler and get fat, but it's subcutaneous fat, and they remain insulin sensitive.
Right.
So you get a sumo wrestler who's freaking huge, a lot of subcutaneous fat, not a lot of visceral fat, insulin sensitive. The idea that carbohydrates cause insulin resistance per se in a metabolically healthy individual is ridiculous and dead. That's not true. It's not to say carbohydrate restriction won't be helpful, but it didn't cause the problem. It didn't cause the fire. We didn't start the fire, you guys. It was always burning since the world has been turning, and that is because of linoleic acid. All right? So carbohydrates may fan the flames in the setting of insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, but they did not start the blaze. It is what we were talking about here. Is protons, it is electrons, it is this idea at the mitochondria and the adipocytes that are messing things up. So anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I mean, I think that was a pretty good show, to be honest with you. Cool.
Last question I always ask people is, what is the most radical thing that you have done recently, my friend?
Okay, well, since you just referenced Billy Joel, a good friend of mine passed away, unfortunately, about a month ago, and at the ceremony of his life, afterwards, our friend brought out a karaoke machine, and I did an absolutely ripping version of Billy Joel's "Only the Good Die Young" in remembrance of Robert. So, and everyone at the event agreed that it ripped. So I was pretty happy about that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's pretty radical, brother. I like some karaoke too. Maybe if you guys come to Austin, you'll see Carnivore MD ripping some karaoke. So we can check you at Fire in a Bottle, Firebrand Meats.
Yes, Fire in a Bottle is the blog. Definitely check out Introduction to Oxidation and the ROS Theory of Obesity. And I love this stuff. It's less popular on the site, but I love the armchair epidemiology stuff, which is where I talk about the traditional French diet, the traditional American diet, the diet of Tibetan mountain like sheep and yak herders. I don't know if you've seen this quote, but a guy from the LA Times went to Tibet and looked at the Tibet yak butter, and he talked about what they ate, and basically every meal was like noodles with this yak and butter in their tea. And then he said they had onions and chilies in this dish with the noodles and the yak. But then he says, incidentally, the vegetables were only for us visiting lowlanders. real nomads don't eat plants.
No kidding.
Yeah, and so that's in my blog.
Right.
In the Armchair Epidemiology series, I have that whole quote out of the LA Times.
Boom.
But,
carnivore diet. Nose-tail carnivore diet. Boom.
So check that out. And yes, definitely check out Firebrand Meats. Obviously, the Croissant Diet and the Feasting Mimicking Diet and Emmy's story are all great. But Firebrand Meats, you will get the best pork that you'll ever have. It's going to be fantastic. The fat is going to be hard and firm. And you're going to be like, wow, I didn't know pork fat could be like this. So sign up for your CSA share today. We need to get enough people together so that we can afford to go in collectively on these pigs. So we're actively searching for membership right now.
That's awesome. And so, all right, you guys, that is it for today. Check us out at heartandsoilsupplements.com. We got beef organs, we got bone marrow and liver. By the time this podcast comes out, we're going to be just about to release Firestarter. Look for gut and digestion. That's going to have that tripe in it. And then blood builders coming soon, you guys. We love you. Stay radical. All right, you guys. Thank you to Brad Marshall, Fire in a Bottle, firebrandmeats.com for that podcast. Really appreciated that one. That was super fun. Like I said, we got geeky. Check out the show notes at heartandsoil.co under the Learn tab. You can find all of my podcasts there. All the videos I do on YouTube, everything is at heartandsoil.co. You can always email me, Dr. Paul, drpaul at heartandsoil.co with your questions. And if you need these references from this study, from this podcast, I'm going to try and get Peter from Hyperlipid on. But this idea, the ROS theory of obesity, Peter's ideas, the protons thread on hyperlipid, and this idea that linoleic acid may just be an evolutionary signal for humans to get fat are intriguing. Something is making us sick. There are good foods and bad foods, you guys. There are good foods and bad foods. It's baloney for anyone to say it's not. People are not just getting sick because they are overeating. As you heard from Emmy's story in this podcast and on my mini podcast earlier, some people are eating 750 calories a day and still gaining weight. How can anyone say that that's calories in, calories out? Her basal metabolic rate is less than 750. Why is it less than 750? And then she changes her diet to include more stearic acid, suet, Firestarter, like the supplement from Heart and Soil, these kind of things. And she loses weight when she gets rid of linoleic acid. It's an N of 1, but it's fascinating. It is fascinating. So this is what I think is so cool. And if you heard the last week's podcast with Ben Beekman, if you didn't, you should listen to it for sure. You'll know that it's these expanding fat cells that are making us ill, that are spewing out 4-HNE, 4-hydroxynonenal, ceramide 1-phosphate, causing systemic issues, metabolic dysfunction, pathological insulin resistance. Where does it come from? Excess polyunsaturated fats. They're just not that common in nature. You can say, well, what about fish? Listen to the videos I've done on omega-3, you guys. Long-chain omega-3s get metabolized in the peroxisomes. They don't get metabolized in the mitochondria in the same way. They don't have the same effect on ROS generation that the shorter-chain fats do. So, interesting. Saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats. The take-home here is eat like your ancestors. Reclaim your ancestral birthrights, radical health. Remember the way we're supposed to eat. On the Heart and Soil website, I recently did a video about the Hadza. And I came across an article. They asked the Hadza to rank their favorite foods. Their favorite food was honey. Their least favorite food were tubers. Those are survival foods. The authors of that study even call that a survival food. Those are fallback foods. Meat was the men's second favorite food. Don't make survival foods the center of your diet. The Hadza spit out most of the fiber in the tubers they're eating, the equa, because it's so fibrous. It's gross. You don't want it. You don't want it. That podcast will be a mini podcast on my show here this Friday coming up. And it's already out on my Instagram. It's already out on my YouTube if you want to see that podcast about the Hadza and tubers. But it's a fascinating appraisal of what they favor. Meat, honey. These are ancestral foods. Occasional fruit. That's fine. Fructose isn't going to hurt you. I talked about it in the podcast with Tommy Wood from a while ago. What will hurt you? Excess linoleic acid. It just doesn't exist that much in nature. But we're getting massive amounts as we're squeezing out of seeds, and it's giving our mitochondria the wrong signal. And it's getting too oxidized. We just can't control that amount. There are good and bad foods. There are. I believe it. There is a species-appropriate diet for humans. Health is not as simple as calories in, calories out. That is an oversimplification propagated by bros who just want to eat Pop-Tarts and multivitamins. And it drives me crazy. So don't fall for it. Understand what your ancestral birthright is. Understand your ancestral programming. Remember that. Don't be wild. Be wild. Don't be domesticated. All right, you guys, stay radical. Check us out, heartandsoil.co. Email me if you have questions. Firestarter's out. Gut and Digestion is out. They are they're selling so well. If you want to get these, go to the website and get them. We're probably going to sell out. We're getting them back in as soon as we can. Beef organs, bone marrow, and liver are out. We're so excited that you guys are loving it. Send me an email. Let me know what you think. And we got blood builder and histamine and immune coming really soon. So even in the first few months of launching this company, we're trying to get you guys 6 supplements, 6 foods to help you kick a whole lot of butt. All right, you guys, love you much. Please support my other sponsors, whiteoakpastures.com, belcampo.com, Let's Get Checked, trylgc.com/carnivoremd, and nutrisense.io. Love the people at forceofnature.com as well. CarnivoreMD is the code at all those spots. Love you guys. Can't wait to hear how you're doing. Stay radical. Until next week. Peace.